Hello. Good morning, everyone. May we request everyone, please, to take your seats and settle down. Again, good morning to our speakers and distinguished guests from the government, the diplomatic sector, the academe, and think tanks. I am Joyce Iles. I am the Community and Advocacy Lead of Stratbase ADR Institute, and I will also be your host and moderator for today. Welcome to the Forum on Countering Gray Zone Operations in the Maritime Indo-Pacific. So this event is organized by Chatbase ADR Institute in partnership with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Philippines. This is a hybrid event, so thank you very much to everyone who is here with us in the venue today. And thank you as well to everyone who is with us via Zoom. As we know, the West Philippine Sea remains to be the focal point of maritime gray zone operations, and China has continued to intimidate civilian fishing vessels, provoke rival territorial claims, and assert its authority in key areas in the West Philippine Sea by using irregular maritime militias composed of civilian craft and personnel. Furthermore, actions of the Chinese Coast Guard, such as the recent use of military-grade lasers against the Philippine Coast Guard in the Ayungin Shoal, and the forceful retrieval of large metal debris from the Philippine Navy in Pag-asa Island, have challenged diplomatic relations between the Philippines and China. As these gray zone operations add another layer of threat to the security and stability of the Philippines and the greater Indo-Pacific, the country is presented with the challenge of launching counter mechanisms by asserting the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal Award and fostering stronger partnerships with other like-minded states. Now, this is going to be a very timely issue, and I'm sure this is going to be a very insightful and interesting discussion today. So without further ado, to deliver today's opening remarks, please welcome Dr. Daniel Schmucking, representative to Cambodia and the Philippines of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very nice introduction. I'm very pleased that we are here together to discuss this important topic. I'm also very happy that the German ambassador to the Philippines is here with us, and that we can partner with Stratbase on that. I know it's always a bit tricky to give opening remarks because you're a little bit in between the actual people with the knowledge, but it's still kind of the ritual to do that. So I tried to make it short and just allow me a few words about my own organization, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and why we are doing this and why this topic is important also for us as a German political think tank. Multilateralism is, and the world rule-based world order is very important, not just for Germany, but for Europe, but also for us as an institution. We are a German institute based in Berlin, but we are active in over 100 countries around the globe. We have a focus on the Indo-Pacific, especially on ASEAN, where we have an office in almost every country. And ASEAN is becoming the battleground of the new strategic power competition. you see that not just, but especially after the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, how the world is shifting, how important it is to take sides, to call out aggressors, big aggressors who just occupy a smaller country. And I think this lesson learned is also something very important for this region here, with also a big country that is rising. And we all have to acknowledge and learn from each other how we deal with that and also how we can cooperate with each other. Our main focus is not just international relations, but it's at our core. We try to discuss in our offices around the globe, but also here in the Philippines, topics that are close to our hearts and where we believe that they have an impact on future developments. And when it comes to ASEAN, it is the case. I would even say that the European Union and ASEAN are role models for multilateralism in their region. And as it is sometimes with role models, they are not perfect. Mistakes have been done, but we are in a process where we can learn from each other. And probably one of the mistakes here in the region is when the Philippines got a ruling for the South China Sea that ASEAN was not backing it up in the way we wanted to do that. And I'm also based in Cambodia, so I kind of know the debate over there and how difficult it was back then to work on a joint statement. Yeah, that our countries are moving closer to each other also shows the current visit of Secretary Manalo in Berlin. He joined first the Munich Security Conference, but later he also joined my institute in Berlin for an aftertalk there. And you see the cooperation is tight. Europe is looking out for the Indo-Pacific. You have all the European new strategies, the EU Indo-Pacific strategy. France came up with a strategy. Germany did. Also the Netherlands. You see that there is a high focus on the region. And we will continue this debate. So I'm very much looking forward to this event. You have a special lineup with interesting speakers, a good debate, hopefully coming. And thank you very much to Stratbase for organizing all that. It's the first time we partner, but hopefully not the last time. I'm looking forward to the event. Please enjoy. Thank you very much.
Right, and thank you very much again to Dr. Daniel Schmoking. And thank you also to Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for partnering with us in this event. All right, and but before we proceed to our keynote speaker, to our attendees here in the venue, you will have a chance later to ask questions to our speakers during the open forum part of the event. You can just raise your hand if you want to ask a question, or you can also write your questions in the papers provided in the center of your table later. And to our Zoom participants, should you have any questions for our speakers later, you can always put your questions in the Q&A box in the lower part of your screen. So we will try our best to also take up your questions later. So to deliver the keynote address, we are very honored to have with us today His Excellency Anka Breifet, or Her Excellency Anka Breifenstoil, Ambassador of the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany, to deliver the keynote address.
Good morning. Lieber Herr Schmücking of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Professor Lindo Manit of Stratbase Institute, experts of maritime challenges and maritime security challenges, guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We are living in challenging and unprecedented times. As we all know, the most dominating subject on the topic of defense and security currently is, of course, the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. With this attack on Ukraine, Russia has violated the most elementary rules of the international order, thereby making its war against Ukraine an overall attack on the international rules-based order that we all, including the Philippines, benefit from. And as this rules-based international order is coming under intense pressure, geopolitical tensions are exacerbating territorial conflicts and the risks of escalation is growing, which is evident, most evident in the Indo-Pacific region. As eyes are focused in Ukraine, there's an increasing nervousness and unease in the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific has become the new arena for strategic competition. The South China Sea is a vital waterway that sees a significant amount of global trade and is home to numerous small island chains, including the Spratly Islands or the Paracel Islands. Gray zone operations in the South China Sea are aiming to assert territorial claims in the region through non-military means, such as the deployment of Coast Guard vessels, maritime militias, and the fortification of islands and elevations. Such actions violate international law and threaten the stability in the region. That is not a legal gray zone. It is clear that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, guarantees the right of freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea. Yet, the activities described undermine this principle and pose a significant threat to regional security and stability. As these actions are mostly below the threshold of military conflict, adequate and yet balanced response is challenging. There needs to be an innovative and collaborative change in thinking and strategy to address these kinds of actions, a Zeitenwende or turning point of sorts. Germany's unique history gives rise to a special responsibility, the obligation to stand by those whose life, whose freedom, and whose rights are threatened. As we experience currently the Zeitenwende, this turning point with regard to Russia's attack on Ukraine, Germany has substantially contributed to upholding the rules-based international order. Germany has committed to deepen its security engagements, especially in the Indo-Pacific, to strengthen the said international order. As new challenges require new solutions, recently Germany's government started a process of crafting the first ever national security strategy. My ministry, the Federal Foreign Office, together with the relevant federal ministries of the German government, as well as the German Bundestag, have launched an inclusive process of taking a comprehensive view of security and taking stock of the challenges that we are facing and that will face in this century. We are also doing this because security policy is more than military plus diplomacy. If investments in infrastructure, if trade policy, if climate change form part of our security, then this means that decisions on security are not taken just in the Foreign Office or the Defense Ministry, but also in business, in municipalities, in civil society and university. What it needs is a comprehensive approach. For Germany's new security strategy, in light of Russia's colossal break with our peaceful order and the increasing tensions in the Indo-Pacific, this means we must ensure that the principles that guide us are translated even more clearly into practical policy. Our Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, highlighted 3 considerations for the new security strategy. First, a clear stance that in matters of war and peace, in matters of justice and injustice, no country can be neutral. Second, a strengthened capability to act. Strength lies in international unity, anchored in mutual respect for international law. Our capability to act rests on the strength of our alliances, on our robustness coming from being neither dependent nor susceptible to blackmail in one's economic and energy relations. And third, enhanced foreign and security policy instruments. because security is not just a question of defense. There are other points aside from the military. If we want to assert ourselves globally in the power struggle of the 21st century, then we must update all of our instruments in keeping with the times in military, political, analog, digital, and technological terms. This new shift in security policy is also rooted in Germany's Indo-Pacific policy guidelines, Germany's Indo-Pacific strategy, which was adopted in 2020. Germany's policy in the Indo-Pacific emphasizes cooperation, collaboration, and solidarity in addressing not only bilateral issues, but also regional and global challenges. The approach of our Indo-Pacific strategy is long-term and inclusive. We focus on the policy fields of strengthening multilateralism and tackling climate change. The Indo-Pacific region can only benefit from peace and stability of all countries in the region if all countries in the region do their part in equal measure. In this regard, we support inclusive regional cooperation. The ASEAN-centric security architecture offers a valuable framework for involving key partners. 2 years have passed since we have conceptualized this Indo-Pacific strategy, and we have identified the following areas for future engagement with our Indo-Pacific partners. This was also discussed in the latest meeting between Minister Baerbock and Foreign Secretary Manalo, as already mentioned by Mr. Schmücking. So the areas that were underlined were strengthening the rules-based international order by promoting compliance with international law. Second, the joint understanding that tackling climate change through expanding and developing partnership to assist high-risk Indo-Pacific countries in coping with the impact of climate change. Reducing dependencies through diversification by supporting negotiations on EU free trade and investment protection agreements with the Indo-Pacific countries. Preventing future economic crisis and reaffirming an inclusive approach by offering cooperation to partners in the region that are committed to the principles of the rules-based order. On this basis, cooperation with the countries of this ever more relevant region is to be expanded. Against this background, Germany's Indo-Pacific strategy remains our compass for cooperation and activities. Rooted in this legal and strategic framework, I can propose several ideas to counter gray zone operations in the Indo-Pacific, namely the following. We need to strengthen partnership with like-minded countries in the region. This can involve cooperation on maritime security, information sharing, joint military exercises, and coordinated diplomatic efforts. We also need to enhance maritime domain awareness through the use of advanced technologies and intelligence gathering. Due to the nature of these activities, there needs to be a concerted effort to identify parties involved and expose their activities. There is also a need to increase and promote economic engagement with countries in the region to create shared interests and reduce incentives for these kind of gray zone operations. And lastly, there is also a need to counter propaganda and disinformation, as these are often aimed at shaping public opinion and undermining regional stability. Countering these efforts through accurate and timely information can help to reduce the effectiveness of gray zone operations. Let me end by reiterating our steadfast commitment to the Indo-Pacific region. And I'm very pleased to see so many representatives of the Philippine Coast Guards here today, which takes me to mentioning that I'm proud that we have started cooperating and partnering with the Philippine Coast Guard not too long ago. And we found a very reliable partner in the Philippine Coast Guard, supporting the efforts of the Philippine Coast Guard, supporting the efforts the Philippines is taking to counter activities that undermine the international rules-based order. And I'm pleased that that we are just prepare the continuation and enlarging the projects in order to really make this partnership a long-standing one. The Philippines are a very important partner for us in this region. We share the same values and we face similar challenges. So I hope for future fruitful cooperation with the Philippines. I thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak here in front of this distinguished audience, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from our experts today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Anka Reifenstoil. Very, very relevant speech, especially on the different points on how to counter gray zone operations in the South China Sea, particularly the strengthening of partnerships with like-minded states, and also, as we know, countering propaganda and disinformation, which is a very big problem right now. So our next speaker is Commodore Jay Tariela, advisor of the Commandant for Maritime Security of the Philippine Coast Guard, and also the PCG spokesperson for the West Philippine Sea. He will be sharing with us the role of the Philippine Coast Guard in addressing gray zone operations in the West Philippine Sea. Ladies and gentlemen, Commodore Jay Tariela.
To Her Excellency Ayungin Shoal, the Ambassador of the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany, Her Excellency Dr. Annika Thunberg from the Embassy of Sweden, to Dr. Daniel Smochking, the representative of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Cambodia and the Philippines, to Professor Victor Andres Manhi, the President of Strat-based Albert de Rosario Institute, to other speakers, to everyone present here and tuned in online, a pleasant morning to everyone. I would like to thank Strat-based for inviting me to speak before you this morning. At the same time, I would like to congratulate the president of this institute for successfully organizing a hybrid town hall that discusses countering gray zone operations in the Indo-Pacific. Before I proceed, I would like to emphasize that I was invited in my capacity as a maritime security scholar. Therefore, my presentation is purely based on my research analysis, and that the opinions or assertions that I might state along the way do not represent the official stand of any institution that I belong to in the national government, specifically the Philippine Coast Guard. To proceed with my presentation, I would like to start by reminding everyone that the People's Republic of China has achieved fait accompli, occupied Mischief Reef in 1995, commenced their 9-line presence in 2005, took over the Scarborough Shoal in 2012, and reclaimed numerous maritime features in 2013 without firing a single shot. I would like to emphasize that Beijing did all of this without resorting to military action. In my short brief, I'll be discussing 3 points. First, I will give a historical and significant information on why the Philippine Coast Guard was able to assume the front seat in the Philippine government's maritime security strategy in the West Philippine Sea. Then, I will discuss the 3 critical roles of the Philippine Coast Guard in addressing gray zone operations in the West Philippine Sea. Lastly, I will present my policy recommendations. Throughout the years, the contribution of the Philippine Coast Guard to our national security has evolved from merely a maritime safety agency to becoming a primary option in patrolling the vast waters of the West Philippine Sea. And while it remained to be identified as a purely maritime law enforcement entity, different from that of the Philippine Navy, it has been performing critical function in asserting our claims without increasing tension among other claimant states. But the question is, why the Philippine Coast Guard? I would argue that there are 3 main reasons why this happened. The first is that the Philippine government learned it the hard way in 2012 the Scarborough Shoal standoff. This incident became the starting point for the countries to recalibrate Coast Guard utilization to a maritime security role, particularly in patrolling the waters in the South China Sea. The standoff made the countries in the region understood that employing naval ships, particularly in carrying out law enforcement, would be considered a diplomatic misstep, especially that the region disdains militarization of the sea row. This particular event also became the starting point for the Coast Guard organizations in the region to seek support from Japan and the United States in capacity building, particularly in acquiring additional vessels. The foreign assistance that these countries previously gave to the Coast Guard organizations has also shifted from maritime safety to maritime security capabilities. The second compelling reason is that the Association of Southeast Asian Nations do not support the deployment of military-grade ships in the waters of South China Sea. Demilitarization of the territorial dispute remained to be the regional norm, not just among the claimant states, but was also supported by all states in the region. It is apparent that countries in Southeast Asia are pushing for the regional norm of Coast Guard utilization. In June 2018, then Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad emphasized that there is an impending danger if naval vessels, particularly gray hulls, are continuously deployed in the contested waters of the South China Sea. Mahathir argued that in the event of dangerous and miscalculated maneuvers, Navy ships are more likely to trigger an armed conflict that may eventually lead to war. He has recognized that contested maritime space is better left for maritime law enforcement ships and white hulls to patrol. The third compelling reason is a strategic direction of the two predecessors of President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Learning from the 2012 Scarborough Shoal standoff, former President Benigno Aquino began to utilize Coast Guard as part of his white ship strategy in the West Philippine Sea. Since China criticized him for militarizing the maritime dispute in 2012, Aquino turned to relying on Coast Guard vessels to maintain the Philippine presence in the West Philippine Sea. However, in the case of President Rodrigo Duterte, the Philippine Coast Guard was widely utilized for appeasement strategy towards China, since the utilization of white ships in patrolling the contested waters does not appear to be provocative. President Duterte learned from his predecessor that he could utilize the Philippine Coast Guard without negatively affecting his closer ties with Beijing, should it tasked to conduct maritime law enforcement patrol in the South China Sea. At the same time, he also became aware that he could take advantage of the functions of the Philippine Coast Guard that could spark cooperation with its Chinese counterpart, the China Coast Guard. Now let me highlight the three active roles of the Philippine Coast Guard in addressing the three gray zone in the maritime Indo-Pacific. I would argue that the most important role of the Philippine Coast Guard in the recent weeks in the West Philippine Sea is removing the shades of gray and exposing it to either black or white. The Philippine Coast Guard's persistent presence in these waters, while at the same time documenting China's activities, allowed the international community to criticize their actions that violate the international law and undermine the rules-based order. The continuous rotational deployment of Philippine Coast Guard's merely 3 offshore patrol vessels allowed the Philippine government to maintain its presence in these waters without being criticized, that is, going against the regional norm of non-provocation and de-escalation. Moreover, the Philippine Coast Guard patrols create not just maritime domain awareness, but it also gives confidence and protects the Filipino fishermen in venturing out at sea. The second most important role of the Philippine Coast Guard recently is to create public and global awareness on what is really happening in the West Philippine Sea every day. The tenacity and confidence of the Philippine Coast Guard, with the guidance and support of the National Task Force West Philippine Sea, to expose the bullying behavior and aggressive actions of China is its most important contribution in countering the gray zone activities in the Indo-Pacific. China's ambiguous undertakings that cannot be clearly defined in the past years allowed them to alter the status quo. The Philippine Coast Guard's role now of becoming a mouthpiece of the National Task Force West Philippine Sea allows the like-minded states to express condemnation and reproach, which puts Beijing into spotlight. Chinese actions in the shadows are now checked, which also forced them to come out in the open to explain or to publicly lie. This behavior can be seen when the pointing of the military-grade laser incident was publicized. The Chinese ambassador had to have his own press conference a few days after. More importantly, the disclosure of incidents in the West Philippine Sea redirects the public discourse among the Filipinos. This is very important, especially this time that fake news, misinformation dominate the narrative on China's stance in the West Philippine Sea. Through the publication of unedited real photos and videos of the Philippine Coast Guard, we can once again reshape the public opinion to weigh things objectively based on facts and not just propaganda. The other positive impact of the Philippine Coast Guard's transparency is to put the Chinese actions in the history books. As an academic, I know that the non-publication of what the incidents that transpired in the South China Sea is not just a disservice to the fellow scholars, but a sin against the next generation of Filipinos. In the future, I want the unborn Filipino people to learn and remember the aggressive actions and bullying behavior of China. So much so that I also hope that the international community will not turn a blind eye on Beijing's gray zone activities that undermines the rules-based order. Lastly, the other role of the Philippine Coast Guard is to promote regional cooperation in the West Philippine Sea. The Philippine Coast Guard's universal functions of maritime safety, marine environmental protection, and maritime law enforcement align with the interests of other countries in ensuring that the sea lines of communications in the South China Sea is protected. Designating Philippine Coast Guard as a primary option in the West Philippine Sea to sustain our presence invigorates cooperation and collaboration. Beyond advancing territorial interests in the South China Sea, the Coast Guard cooperation is valuable in addressing non-traditional security threats, promoting rules-based governance, and ensuring Southeast Asia's waterways are safe and secure. The Philippine Coast Guard was able to harmonize its approach with countries in Vietnam, Malaysia, Japan, and even the United States. Philippine Coast Guard's cooperation vary from addressing illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, piracy, armed robbery at sea, drug trafficking, maritime terrorism, oil spill response, smuggling, ship collision, search and rescue, and responding to maritime disasters. These functions provide more avenues of cooperation and promote regional collaboration. For the last part of my presentation, I will push for 3 policy recommendations. First, the national government should support the modernization of the Philippine Coast Guard. The Philippine Coast Guard's additional offshore patrol vessels, aircraft, establishment of MDA infrastructure, and construction of Coast Guard response bases will definitely increase our capability in monitoring gray zone activities, not just in the West Philippine Sea, but even in various parts of the country. Right now, there were already reports of incursions in our northern territories and the eastern seaboard, particularly Benham Rice. Moreover, the acquisition of these vessels will not also be interpreted as a naval arms race, since it will just be white ships. Second is to maintain the Philippine Coast Guard as our option in patrolling the West Philippine Sea, as supported by the Philippine Navy. As a maritime security scholar, I appreciate the critical role of our Philippine Navy in defending our territorial sovereignty, a role that the Philippine Coast Guard can never assume because that is for the Philippine Navy to perform. However, we should learn from what had happened in the 2012 Scarborough Shoal standoff. We cannot allow ourselves to fall again in the gray zone trap of China to paint the Philippine image as a warmongering nation. The current approach for now is to tap our white ships. The strategy is in accordance with the regional norms so that we can de-escalate the tension among other claimant states and at the same time does not provoke other countries. Lastly, I would like to emphasize that the best way to address Chinese gray zone activities in the West Philippine Sea is to expose it. In the very near future, it is almost impossible that the Philippines can get close to China's military and economic power. However, it does not mean that we cannot do anything to change their bully behavior and compel them to obey the international law because we are that weak. Let us not allow ourselves to suffer silently because of their harassments and hostile actions. I believe that majority of the states in the world remain to embrace the international order that was established after the Second World War. where international laws are respected and human rights are protected. Maraming salamat po at mabuhay ang kasandaluhan ng Armed Forces of the Philippines, ang mga tauhan ng Philippine Coast Guard who continuously patrol the West Philippine Sea despite the danger and at the same time disregarding their own safety. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commodore Jay Tariela. And I would just like to echo what he said. Thank you very much to our Philippine Coast Guard for ensuring the safety of our waters and, of course, the areas, the citizens living in these islands. We are also pleased to welcome our next speaker, Colonel Raymond Powell, U.S. Air Force retired from the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation and the Project Miyoshu in Stanford University, California. He will be talking about how to harness technology to deter gray zone operations. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Raymond Powell.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you and to represent, if we could have the slides, please, represent the Gordian Knot Center for National Security and Innovation at Stanford University. Project Miyoshu was incepted as a part of the Gordian Knot Center's mandate to use entrepreneurial methods to solve tough national security challenges, which it has done for many years through the Hacking for Defense program, where Stanford students take novel approaches, relentlessly look at their problem statement, make sure they're trying to solve the right problem, have a lot of interviews, and eventually come up with novel solutions. We simply took this in a different direction. We're not students, but we were interested in solving a policy problem, and we're grateful to the Gordian Knot Center for taking us on board and letting us take a hard look at the West Philippine Sea. And where we ended up was in the information space, as many of you are aware. Next slide, please. So our bottom line set of assumptions is, first of all, why does China operate in the gray zone? It operates in the gray zone because it is gray. I know that sounds very profound, but essentially things that happen in the gray zone remain opaque and deniable, and China can simply say, it didn't happen that way, right? We saw that with the laser incident. Even when it came to light, they tried to say, well, it was a classroom laser, it was a speed checker that police use. Even when it's brought to light, they try to deny it and use other explanations. But bringing things into the light is how you disrupt gray zone operations. And so exposure is the key to doing two things. One is, as has been indicated, I think already by previous speakers, building resilience into your society, right? Ultimately, your government needs the support of the people in order to take make hard decisions like pushing back against China or building maritime capacity. Those are difficult policy decisions, and there are lots of pressures for governments to do other things or to back off. And so by bringing those things into the light, it builds the support of the public so that governments can make the hard decisions. And also, over the long term, this should deter those activities. When China knows that the activities that it makes, or the activities that it does in the West Philippine Sea will end up on the news in the Philippines that night, that is going to make them think twice, recalculate, is this actually really worth it? This is a long-term play, right? It's the Beijing is not going to withdraw its maritime militia from Sabina Shoal because there was a news report on the CNN Philippines at 5 o'clock last night. What it is it's a way for Beijing to recalculate and say, do we want to really spend all of our time fighting everybody, everywhere, all the time over everything? And at some point, is it not worth it to maybe just let those fishing ships at Sabina Shoal go fish somewhere else, rather than continuously push to the edges of their 9-dash line claim? So by and large, the reason that we took the approach we have taken, which is to emphasize the use of commercially available information is because governments, by and large, are slow to release information. Now, my friend Jay here has been trying very hard to prove that wrong because the Philippine Coast Guard has been very prolific in releasing information recently, and I really applaud that. I think that's a tremendous step. I'm sure, though, that the Coast Guard and the government in the Philippines will come under pressure to stop doing that, right? There will be all kinds of political pressures. They'll hear from, say Chinese embassy, they'll hear from business people, they'll hear from lots of different places. Stop making so much trouble. Stop releasing things. So it's important that outside organizations, that civil society continue to put the information out there so that that gives the government in Manila more cover to be able to say, look, it's already out there. It's not us putting it out there all the time. This information, our people are worked up about this. They're demanding change. And so it's important for us to be out there in that space. Go ahead and please go to the next slide. So what we've been building is a concept we call sea light for obvious reasons. And the idea is to light up that maritime gray zone to just as Jay mentioned, to take that gray area and make it black and white, make it very clear what's happening so that people can respond to what's actually happening rather than sort of distant rumors and narratives coming out of other capitals about what's happening. And so we're trying to take this technology that is rapidly evolving on the commercial side and combine it with the ability to analyze and narrate and tell stories, and do that while in contact with research centers here in the Philippines, in the United States, and elsewhere. Do it in concert with the media, other civil society organizations like Stratbase, and of course, in concert with government agencies. Honestly, if everyone in the Philippine government was coming to me saying, you're ruining everything, you're messing up all of our plans, we would be discouraged from doing what we're doing, but that's not what we're hearing. What we're hearing is actually a lot of encouraging messages saying this is really helping. Next slide, please. So the last time I presented at a Stratbase event was kind of the start of, I guess, our public profile here in the Philippines. At the time, we had talked about an incident out at Scarborough Shoal, Panatag Shoal, in which a Philippine Navy ship, the BRP Andres Bonifacio, went out on what I would term, and again, my Philippine Navy friends can correct me, a show the flag operation, right? Reminding China that the Philippines has not given up on its rightful claim to the resources at Scarborough Shoal. And so the Andres Bonifacio went out. It was confronted by the Chinese Coast Guard ship that's always there. They went in parallel for a little while, and then the Bonifacio went back. And so it was, in many senses, it was sort of a minor incident, and everything was very controlled and happened, I think, in not too alarming a way, but it was something that had not yet been talked about. And so it sort of brought out the fact that this information is out there. If Ray Powell can find it, anybody, well, not anybody, other people can find it. Now, there is a reason that Ray Powell was able to find it, and that's because we have access to some tools that normally cost money. Our access right now is on a very generous relationship with the data provider that has allowed us to, during our startup period, to operate for free or for very little money for a little while, but eventually as we get funding, we'll be able to increase our number of data sources. But it was sort of meant as an example of what can be done using commercially available data. And as the slide indicates, it got a lot of attention, and we had a pretty exciting 24-hour news cycle at Project Miyoshu. So that gave us the idea that this really was kind of a proof of concept. There is a demand for this kind of information, and we do have kind of a unique take on this that others aren't. We're filling a space in the ecosystem that others aren't yet filling. Next slide, please. Just because it was a target of opportunity and it was sort of obvious on the data that I was looking at, I decided to try this out in Malaysia to see what would happen, and presented some information about a similar kind of incident. It was a Malaysian Navy ship that went out to monitor the activities of the China Coast Guard ship out of Laconia Shoals in their EEZ. And that tweet that I put out, and so this was sort of the start of my my Twitter career. That tweet that I put out got the attention of a rather niche Malaysian newspaper. But as things happened, there was a news conference with the defense minister of Malaysia the next day, and he was asked specifically about this. And many people in Malaysian civil society found his answers unsatisfying. And there was sort of a, well, you know, they have claims and we have claims, and it's very difficult to figure these things out. And that did not go over well with a lot of Malaysian civil society. And by the end of the event, you'll see down in the lower right, the Defense Ministry of Malaysia felt compelled to clarify Malaysia's rightful claims to its own EEZ. And that was, I think, very helpful, just sort of all around, to make sure that, you know, Malaysian government is accountable and is responsive to the desires of their society. And also, of course, to clarify that international law remains international law, even if there is a gray zone actor operating in your EEZ. Next slide, please. So you may have heard something about a laser. Apparently it was a pretty big deal. Some of you are aware that a week before the release of the information about the laser, there was a tweet coming from a guy named Ray Powell that indicated that I believe that there was harassment of the BRP Malapascua at this time. I will confess to you right now that not all of my information was accurate. There were the exact place and of the harassment and the manner of it was, and I caveated my tweet pretty heavily to say there's only so much I can tell from looking at AIS returns. But it seemed apparent to me that the Chinese ship had gone out to the place that the Philippine ship was and had gone dark intentionally, that the Philippine ship had then made a movement and the Chinese ship only reappeared when the Philippine ship had departed to the north. And based on the evidence that I saw, it appeared to me that there was harassment. At the end of the day, of course, what happened, I think, was very important and was sort of the starting point for a lot of the things that Jay was talking about was this new policy of openness. And I can't tell you exactly what percentage of the deliberations about that policy involved this pain in the neck out in Stanford University putting out information. But I have been told that there was an element of that in the deliberations, that, you know, the information is out there and it's important that we respond to it. And so I'm just, again, I can't praise the Philippine Coast Guard and the government of the Philippines enough for this new policy, which I think is absolutely a step in the right direction. Next slide, please. So we are trying to build a program. So far, we are in fundraising mode, but eventually we will have staff. We will have regular subscriptions to these data providers. We will have a travel budget and all of those things that we're working on. So this is just to say that this is what we're working on. Next slide, please. So the bottom line here is that an engaged public is really what is the key in an open society and in a democracy to making sure that the government has the political space to be able to push back against gray zone activity. And there's more information out there than ever in the commercial space and the public space, and the costs are coming down. It's still pretty expensive, but the costs are coming down. And so, what we're doing is only sort of the harbinger of things to come. There is going to be more and more and more on the open source side, as we've seen in Ukraine, for example, where the open source has been a huge part of the battle space there. It's a harder thing to do in a maritime space. There are fewer sensors, as we say, but it is happening. And finally, the reason we're doing what we're doing is to create this sort of community of open source analysts and storytellers, people who can be out there telling the story. So it shouldn't just be Project Miyoshu. It should be others. And I'll talk about that here in just a second, because I do actually have a couple of recommendations going forward. Next slide, please. So, very attractive fellow there. You may have seen him on the news. I certainly have. But I think, in terms of leveraging transparency, there are a couple of things that I believe that the Philippines can do to kind of capture this moment and make sure that this remains kind of a long-term win for the Philippines. Next slide, please. First of all, the way that we get information about what happens in the maritime space comes from commercial automated information system receivers. A lot of those are satellites. Two problems with satellites. One is they can't pick up everything. And two is that they tend to be expensive. So people will charge you for what they show you from satellite-based AIS receivers. The others are more accurate, but they're terrestrial. They have to be on land somewhere, meaning they have to have access to power and the internet. Those are very available. And so what I'm showing you here is from Vessel Finder and Marine Traffic, two of the main providers of terrestrial AIS receivers. You'll see that they have actually not as many of these receivers as you might think. The amazing thing is that if you are in a place where they need a receiver, they will almost certainly give you one for free. All you have to do is contact them and say, here's where I am. I'm on this mountain near the coast. I have an office out at Pag-asa. I have this great place that, of course, they want it because they serve shipping companies and they'd like to be able to charge them for the information that they receive. If you order one and all you have is it's kind of a box with an antenna. It's very simple. And you put it at your business or your house or your outpost or wherever. The Coast Guard could do this. Individual citizens could do this. News agencies could do this. And once you do this, they will also usually give you premium subscription to their service. So you will get to see a lot of the same things that we see at Project Miyoshu. So again, you can go out, there's like 8 of these companies. These are 2 of the big ones. I would love to be able to see little green dots all over all over the Philippines and in the Philippine outposts. Again, all you have to do is tell them I've got power and internet and I'm willing to plug this thing in and keep it connected. And they will give it to you for free. So you can look at this from a government perspective, you can look at this from a civil society perspective, a media perspective. Anyone can do this. Next slide, please. Embedded reporters. You may recall, if you are old enough, that during the first Iraq war back in the early 90s, the US used a system of pooled reporters. So we took all of you media people and we put you in a cage over here and we said, okay, we have something interesting for you to look at, so you and you can come with us, you can go look at this thing, and then we'll put you back in the cage and you can tell all your friends. Happy? No, of course you weren't. And so the media wasn't happy with that. But the US military actually figured out that it could learn important lessons. And one of the lessons it learned is, maybe we should look at this system of embedding reporters. And so by the early 2000s, we were doing that. And what we found out was reporters were actually very responsible when you gave them direct access to this information. They didn't want to give away secrets. They didn't want to endanger the people they were with or ruin their access. And they sympathized with the people they were with. They found out they were responsible. They found out they were professional, and they wanted to tell those stories. And so the benefits of embedding reporters actually vastly outweighed the risks. And so I think that there's a role for this in the West Philippine Sea, and I'd encourage my Philippine government and military friends to strongly consider increasing your use of embedding in order to let other voices tell the story of what's happening in the West Philippine Sea. It doesn't all have to be on you. You don't always have to say the Philippine Coast Guard said that China did this. You can have the people that are standing in the back of the room with the cameras and these microphones who tell that story for you. And then when China or the business person or whoever it is objects and says, stop putting out so much information, you can simply say, look, this is our national policy. We're an open society, and we encourage the media to be part of this so that the Philippine people can know what we're doing. If we're out there and another country points a laser at us and there happens to be an ABS-CBN reporter on the ship, that story is going to get told. We're not telling it. That's our transparency policy, something we believe in as an open society. So again, something I'd strongly consider the government to look into. And the last slide, I believe. So this is us. This is what we do. If you would like to get in contact with me, I have an email address up there. You may have heard I have a Twitter account. That is me. And our website is also there. So please feel free to take a look and get in contact with us if you'd like to talk more about this. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much, Colonel Raymond Powell. Now, to talk about responding to gray zone operations in the Indo-Pacific alliances and strategic partnerships, please welcome Dr. Renato De Castro, trustee and program convener of Strat-based ADR Institute.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and honor to be given a chance to share my view regarding force gray zone and how we could address gray zone. So my specific topic is looking at the role of alliances. So let me start with just discussing what had happened recently. Kind of surprising even for me. Working? So we have, of course, this event that happened last year when you have two defense secretaries announcing that they're more or less modernizing the alliance, reaffirming the alliance. Then, of course, both defense, if I can remove this. Yeah. So you have, of course, both official recognizing the need that the alliance have to be modernized, addressing issues, security issues. Then, of course, supposed to be the goal was to implement EDCA. That was, of course, the implementation was delayed for about 6 years because of a president who simply does not believe in the importance of our alliance with the United States. Two sides, of course, eventually decided that we will hold 500 military exercises. This is, of course, a qualitative increase from the 250 that happened last year. And, of course, what was that caught the attention of analysts, diplomats, and, of course, the media, the decision of the current president to increase the number of EDCA sites that would lead to a greater U.S. strategic footprint in the Philippines. So FOSB provides strategic advantage just in case you have a push comes to shove in the West Philippine Sea. And of course, the issue that people are looking at right now, which I considered the most dangerous flashpoint in the region, the Taiwan Straits. So the 6 scenarios was simply unthinkable during the last 6 years because just like I mentioned, we had a president who did not believe in our alliance with the United States. So of course, during his first 4 years, it was really a classic case of appeasement, something that Jay mentioned earlier. So paradoxically, despite his effort to effect a rapprochement with China, the gray zone operation continued. And this is something I'll be discussing later. Eventually, the Duterte administration realized that despite its effort to appease China, Chinese gray zone operation continued way into its term. So they also realized that downplaying or ignoring the incident, something that Jay and the current administration is trying to, of course, amend or rectify, it will continue at a more intense scale. Of course, the fear is China will eventually gain control of the fishing grounds without the Philippine government raising hell. And my presentation, of course, would focus on why there was a realization that the alliance really matter, even, of course, addressing gray zone operation. Let me just proceed. I'll just proceed to my point. So the concept of gray zone, these are just some of the questions that I would like to address. So what are some of the key gray zone operations that was conducted even during the time of the Duterte administration? Jay has already mentioned some. I will just breeze through them. So what do we mean by gray zone? Gray zone are considered political. They're political because, quoting Clausewitz, in an extension of war by other means, reversing Clausewitz. That would be war is an extension of policy by other means. It's the other way around. It's extension of war through politics. So they involve, of course, whole warfare. In fact, it's a form of warfare without the use of force. And just like any form of warfare, the goal is, of course, to alter the status quo. But, of course, it's a rate of actual employment of the Army and the Navy on the battlefield. Rather, of course, especially in the light of what's happening in the South China Sea, you have, of course, as mentioned by Jay and other speakers, Chinese fishing vessels suspected to be manned by what is called the three waves of Chinese maritime expansion: the People's Liberation Army's Navy, the Chinese Coast Guard, and the Maritime Militia, and of course, all aim at asserting Chinese maritime rights and interests in the South China Sea. Of course, some of the cases that Jay mentioned, I won't have to discuss them further. What happened on Mischief Reef on 1995, where you have, of course, Chinese structure being built, but it was only discovered in February 1996. Then this again, Jay, what mentioned, Scarborough Shoal. I did not discuss this. So what happened? China took control of the Scarborough Shoal. Just have to breeze through this. Of course, we have a president in 2016 who basically conducted and launched a policy of appeasement with the hope of moderating Chinese coercive behavior in the South China Sea. So this is some of the key points when you talk about appeasement. So I'll have breeze through this. This is thing from the United States, setting aside the ruling, even announcing to the world that the Chinese Navy is welcome to operate in the Philippine waters, just don't mess up with the Philippine Coast Guard. So, despite President Duterte's effort to appease China, of course, Chinese gray zone operation continued. So these are some of the cases of Chinese gray zone operation. And then I will not focus on this. You can discuss this later. There are, of course, cases of Chinese gray zone operation. And, of course, China is working to achieve nothing less than the subjugation. This is the very essence. This is the goal of Chinese gray zone operation. Nothing less than subjugation of its neighbor civilian maritime population, which, of course, in turn would lead to Beijing's expansion and authoritarian vision of maritime sovereignty inside China's 9-9 claim. So China's intention is to gain a position of advantage in conflicts over territorial sovereignty and maritime rights and interests. Of course, I will just mention this because this is where, of course, the Duterte administration realized that it had to stand up against China's gray zone operation by basically, number one, challenging China, and number two, of course, realizing the role of alliances, which I would emphasize later. So initially, of course, Filipino decision makers denied that there's such a thing as a gray zone operation. The Philippine government, however, realized that downplaying or ignoring these incidents enabled China to advance its agenda of maritime expansion through, of course, gray zone operation. To the point that China realized, or basically took into account, there's no need to use force or deploy the People's Liberation Army's Navy to achieve the goal. Of course, the change in government view happened in this case. I'll just breeze through this. I would not emphasize. So, of course, what happened was Secretary Lorenzana announced. Suddenly, you have vigorous government response to Chinese gray zone operation at Winston Shoal. Some of the features of gray zone operation. The goal, of course, is to accomplish an overwhelming presence. What it's doing, you basically have to face the presence of Chinese fishing vessels. So let's just breeze through this, what basically happened and why it realized that alliance do matter. Okay, some of the points. So during the Winston Shoal operation, you have assurances that came from the Biden administration. Jake Sullivan contacted his counterpart, Secretary Anthony Blinken, called Secretary Locsin. Secretary Lloyd Austin sent a message, of course, to then Secretary Lorenzana. And early, of course, you have the deployment of a carrier battle group. That period, President Duterte ignored it, primarily because of the fact that he still have this intense attitude vis-a-vis the United States. But nevertheless, of course, the gray zone operation did not prevent top Biden administration officials in contacting their Filipino counterparts, which of course led to the reinvigoration of the alliance even before this current administration. There's already a recognition that alliance do matter. Okay, so by the end, a few months before the end of President Duterte's term, in fact, the roadmap for the improvement of the alliance had already been negotiated and signed in the form of the joint vision for the alliance for the 20th century. So let's just proceed. Just proceed to the last part here. So why do alliance matter? This is the main point of my discussion. I'll just have to breeze through this. So just a point regarding alliance. Okay, it's a key point. So why do alliance matter? First of all, alliances generate assurances to reduce a weaker ally's sense of vulnerability by promising protection through, of course, defense commitment and forward presence on both civilian and maritime forces, especially for a country that at this point in time seems to lack the political will to challenge China. But just like I mentioned, alliances are convenient. What is important for this administration is to develop the political will to stand up against Chinese gray zone operation. So to limit China's ability to conduct gray zone operation against the Philippines. And of course, this became very apparent during the Winston Shoal incident and the recent laser, the use of laser against the Philippine Chinese Coast Guard vessel. It requires support from other countries. Manila, Washington, Canberra, Tokyo, and even the EU expressed support, signals commitment commitment for mutual assistance through security agreements, troop deployments, arm transfer, multinational exercises, thereby, of course, reducing the sense of vulnerability of the weaker state. And of course, in this case, it's the Philippines. So hopefully, alliance could buy time for the Philippines to develop the political will to recognize and stand up against China's gray zone operation. Of course, this has also been mentioned earlier, the development of a surveillance system, to monitor Chinese gray zone operation. This requires the development of regional. Actually, we already have it. Coast Watch South, so forth and so on. It's simply a matter of enhancing them and, of course, basically enabling them to monitor the presence of Chinese vessels as they form for gray zone operation. Of course, the first one had to do with defensive measures. The challenge for the Philippines to show that it has political will is to take the offensive. So this required what I call conducting shaping operation against China. The point in gray zone operation is that you should not always be the victim. You should take the initiative to take the battle to the other side. But of course, not through the military means, but simply, of course, on doing, giving the other side a dose of their medicine. So shaping operation or coercive tactics aim to complicate an adversary's calculation, primarily target the strategic intention, not necessarily by force. I'll give a specific case. We have people here in government who might consider this, and I'll give you a specific case. So the goal is to create a sharp deterrent effect by undermining the adversary's sense of initiative, deprive him the chance to launch the offensive, and of course, leadership of the crisis triggered by its gray zone operation through the imposition of multiple dilemmas, posturing asset to the threat, what adversaries values, and displaying willingness, and more importantly, showing willingness to confront. A good example is the case of Indonesia and Malaysia. When they were trying to survey, in case of Indonesia, the North Natuna waters, Malaysia, its continental shelf. China told them, don't do it. They did otherwise, without any ally, without any ruling. Probably the Philippine government could consider this in the terms of unilateral exploration at the Reed Bank, despite Chinese warning. We have our treaty allies, we have our security partners, and we have our arbitral ruling. What the Philippines simply lacks is political will. So by having political will, we could take the initiative against the other side. So not simply becoming victim or the passive participant in this game of cat and mouse, which we call gray zone operation. The last part, of course, is the importance of multilateralism. We already have a coalition that is already out there. You have the informal security partnership of 4 countries, Manila, Canberra, Tokyo, and of course, Washington, D.C. But this should not be an exclusive club. ASEAN should be involved in this through forums. Not necessarily all of ASEAN, but ASEAN countries like Indonesia and Malaysia and even Vietnam, who have, of course, an interest in the maritime domain. So I think this is the last. I'll just go to my conclusion. So, of course, the case of the Duterte administration applying appeasement. Unfortunately, of course, this was a case of unrequited love. China never returned the love that Duterte showed to China. Rather, he had the same treatment that China would do to any sitting government to expand and, of course, apply gray zone operation. Philippine political leaders eventually at least realized this is the first step in addressing gray zone operation. It is happening, and I am the target. There's no sense of denying it. Of course, at the end of the day, of course, reflected the discovery, and of course, the last slide. On this two maritime incident, the Philippines showed to the world that the best way of countering Chinese gray zone operation is to deny China's goal of to win without actually fighting by showing the will to resist, and of course, taking into account alliances and multilateral arrangements that, of course, be able to give China a dose of its own medicine. I end my presentation here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Renato de Castro, for that very strong and insightful message. Okay, for our next speaker, we have Dr. Charmaine Willoughby, Associate Professor at the De La Salle University, Manila. She will be discussing implementing a responsive national security strategy against gray zone operations. Please welcome Dr. Willoughby.
Thank you very much, Joyce. Ambassador Anka Reifenstuhl, Dr. Daniel Schmucking, Sir Dindo Manhit. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's always a pleasure to stand before you and to share some insights about maritime security. The Philippines is increasingly facing gray zone challenges in the West Philippine Sea. In fact, at this point, it has become almost dangerously normal to see Chinese vessels in Philippine waters. The Philippines rightfully continues to protest these actions, but as these are activities below the threshold of war, and considering as well our own resources, we are then very much constrained in our response. Nonetheless, speaking out and filing diplomatic protests should be sustained, and we really cannot afford to drop the ball on this. That being said, as important as calling China out for its gray zone operations, the Philippines ought to do more in this regard. So within this context, I argue in my short remarks today that there is a need indeed to break down, demystify even the concept of the gray zone, because that is one way in which the Philippines can draft a more responsive national security strategy. Let me then begin by first dissecting what we mean by gray zone. There's a growing literature on the subject that posits that the phenomenon is not as murky, not as gray, really, as it is made out to be. The thing is, oftentimes we use the term gray zone as a convenient umbrella to categorize a bunch of activities that we don't really have definitive means to address. For instance, we like to say that the gray zone is the theater for hybrid warfare. This is not inaccurate per se, but it is indicative of a mismatch between our capabilities and the new breed of warfare out there. Other examples of gray zone tactics, which China has consistently deployed, are economic coercion, information campaigns, and the use of proxy forces, like its maritime militia. These are all activities below the threshold of war. And so, unfortunately, the means at our disposal are severely limited. Meanwhile, the enemy has achieved its objectives. This is the classic salami strategy, or death by 1,000 cuts. What I'm trying to say is that, as provocative as it is to use the term gray zone, we really are better off calling a spade a spade. The term gray zone is, pardon me for being an academic here, taxonomically convenient. But to counter it, we need to demystify it. And one way to do that is to understand that China uses coercion, whether militarized or non-militarized, to establish a reputation for resolve in defending its sovereignty. We then need to look at the economic and geopolitical costs at play when it tries to exercise this resolve. Let me give two instances. In the 1990s, in the wake of the end of the Cold War and the US bases were shut down in the Philippines, China's resolve to defend its sovereignty was very high. Couple this with very low economic and geopolitical costs, and we got a China that was inclined towards military coercion in the South China Sea. It was in 1994, for instance, when China deployed naval ships to blockade a Vietnamese oil rig. And in 1995, when China seized and occupied Mischief Reef. Meanwhile, from 2007 onwards, China's resolve remained high, the economic costs remained low, but the geopolitical costs shot up way, way high. This meant that there was a potential backlash from the United States or its allies. This combination of factors resulted in non-militarized coercion on the part of China. So, for example, in 2008, China threatened to impose economic sanctions against ExxonMobil in response to its planned collaboration with Vietnam to explore for oil in the South China Sea. In 2011 to leading up to 2012, China imposed diplomatic and economic sanctions on the Philippines over the incident in the Scarborough Shoal. China imposed a month-long ban on Philippine banana exports to China and canceled senior-level meetings between leaders of the two countries. Apart from that, it also used maritime surveillance ships to blockade or ram Philippine vessels. Understanding these dynamics can break down the otherwise murky concept of the gray zone. The exercise can likewise prove extremely helpful for the Philippines as we draft a new national security strategy. Threat perception and prioritization is critical, but our NSS must likewise emphasize three things that can better position the country in addressing challenges in the so-called gray zone and beyond. First, we need transparency in drawing attention to coercive activities as they happen. Doing so increases the cost for China and other actors of initiating intimidating behaviors. Likewise, this can reduce the likelihood of repetition. Effective transparency, and my fellow speakers spoke of this as well. Effective transparency measures can include the publication of reports and studies. And the sooner that we do this, when these activities are happening, the sooner these reports come out, the better off we would be. Second, we need deterrence capabilities. This is our stick. Of course, this dovetails very neatly into the need to complete the modernization of our armed forces. but it also necessitates the diversification of our international relations and deepening our partnerships with like-minded countries. Third, we need a whole of government approach, one that posits a clear and consistent messaging of our national interest. At the end of the day, it is indeed how we craft our own narrative. So let me end here and hope that we can carry the discussion forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Charmaine Willoughby. Now to talk about gray zone operations in the West Philippine Sea, civil and military interoperability and deterrence strategies, let us all welcome Rear Admiral Romel Jude Ong, Professor of Praxis at the Ateneo School of Government and trustee of the Foundation for National Interest.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Before I begin, let me greet my seniors, former Chief of Staff General Manny Bautista, retired Rear Admiral Buchuares, sir, retired Marine Commandant Ariel Capulitan. I think I saw Vice Admiral Abet Carlos here. Yun. And of course, the Navy contingent on the other side. So my topic is about deterrence. I can actually discuss this in one slide, but I need to lay the predicate, so it's going to cost you a few more slides to get there. Next slide, please. I begin with a quote from a former Assistant Associate Chief Justice Carpio, and you can read it. Next slide, please. Now, there's a conversation that gray zone is not hybrid warfare, but nevertheless, I'm taking off the perspective of its hybrid warfare and very involved in hybrid conflict. Case being because we're dealing with a state actor that is using non-state means to achieve its objectives. Next slide, please. So this is a literature from a Western perspective on what hybrid warfare is. Next slide, please. This is from a Chinese perspective, and it's based on the three warfare strategy. Basically, the interplay of media warfare, psychological, and legal. And the enabler of this, of course, the PLA, People's Liberation Army. Totally different from United Front Works, which is being done at the party level in terms of influence operations. Next slide, please. So these are the components of a three warfare strategy of PRC or PLA. And we always see this manifest in the conversation, both internationally and domestically. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of mind setting, when we look at conventional warfare, it's stovepipe towards a military-centric activity. So this is how conventional warfare is perceived. But if you look at hybrid warfare, it's the interplay of all the forces at play, of instruments of national power. So we have to deal with it from a perspective of both diplomatic, propaganda, military, and economic. And you cannot, from the way PRC uses it, it flows from one to the other. Unlike in a Western mindset, we tend to stovepipe things. We'd like them to put in little box, nice, pretty little boxes, but it doesn't work that way. It's a mixed bag. Next slide, please. Now, as a Navy person, I always approach gray zone from the context of its sea control. So I always refer to the guru of naval strategy, which is Alfred Thayer Mahan, who looks at this as sea control. But unfortunately, it doesn't explain some of the components of gray zone that are there. The elements are, and it cannot be approached from a purely naval strategic perspective. Primarily because the end state of a naval strategy from a Thayer perspective would always be, it will end up kinetic in one way or another. And the conundrum of gray zone is, it is effective, but it never goes kinetic. So in a way, we have to look at different models. So we look at David Galula. David Galula is a French officer, and his body of work as an academe, although he's a practitioner, is on counterinsurgency warfare. Okay. Next slide, please. So borrowing from Galula, we look at, I think this appears in chapter 5 of his work, the 4 laws of counterinsurgency. Okay. And I try to juxtapose the 4 laws to the current situation in the South China Sea. Now, when Galula talks of counterinsurgency, it's between the dynamics of the insurgent, in this case is PRC, the counterinsurgent, which is us, and the populace. Populace being the prime objective of any insurgency. So I think we can correlate populace to maybe Southeast Asia or ASEAN, if we just look at this region. So the first one, he says, the support of the population is necessary for a counterinsurgent. In this case, to overturn gray zone, you need the support of ASEAN. Okay. Whether we like it or not. And we all know that ASEAN has heavily been compromised because of the alliance-breaking strategy of PRC, and it's very effective. The second law is support is gained through an active minority. It cannot be everybody. So you have a minority that is active, a minority that is against it, and a plurality that doesn't care. It's neutral. It doesn't care. So the point is, you look for that active minority. And that would be build a minilateral coalition. You need to start from somewhere. Like-minded democracies or like-minded states. For example, we take the emerging trilateral collaboration between the Philippines, Japan, and US to its natural course. That would be a minilateral. That would be Galula's active minority. Third law. Support from the population is conditional. In this case, credibility is important. The credibility of the active minority is important. Again, if we take it to logical conclusion, as long as there are Chinese Coast Guard quasi-blockading, because blockading is an act of war. So I'll use the term quasi-blockade. As long as the Chinese Coast Guard is still quasi-blockading Ayungin Shoal and Panatag Shoal, any alliance will have zero credibility. Any partnership will have zero credibility. Okay. Because the population, or in this case ASEAN or Southeast Asia, will always question whatever you say, they are still in your EEZ. And the last law, intensity of effort and vastness of means are essential. That means we need to concentrate, not dissipate, concentrate resources, the effort, so that we have our theory of victory. And what is the theory of victory? It's not about kinetic. It's not about the destruction of the maritime force of PRC. It's compelling or convincing Southeast Asia or the rest of ASEAN no longer to submit to Chinese demands. That is your theory of victory. Next, please. If we look at were there successful maritime counterinsurgency efforts in the past, there is. We look at the Cod Wars between UK and Iceland Won. Iceland at that time has no Navy and no Coast Guard. They just have tugboats. And they were able to compel the international communities, particularly the UK, to recognize its EEZ. Next slide, please. So, when we talk of gray zone, we need to deconstruct gray zone. I think Charmaine already broached that construct, no? But we need to, this is a graphical representation of what Charmaine has said. You need to deconstruct gray zone because what we only see is the Chinese Coast Guard and the militia. But it's not that way because it's an ecosystem. Okay? So me as a Navy person, I do not look at the Coast Guard and the militia. I look at the PLA Navy behind the Coast Guard and the militia. So I call it the enforcer. Okay? I call it the enforcer. Now, these assets cannot sustain itself without a base. And that's where the occupied islands and features come into play because those are your logistics. Those are part of your operational logistics. You cannot wish them away. The militia is a placeholder. If you look at how they are deployed, militias are deployed in shoals and reefs or features that are not occupied by anybody. But it seems it may appear to be important to them. Okay? The Coast Guards are deployed in areas that are quote-unquote contested. Contested meaning somebody is occupying it and they are interested in that property. Example is, of course, Ayungin Shoal and Scarborough Shoal. Next slide, please. This is just my threat board. So this is where, when you look at the Philippines, it's always an archipelago, and you cannot just focus on the West Philippine Sea. There are so many moving pieces to it. Not only West Philippine Sea, of course, Luzon Strait is also important. That's why in terms of conversation, we're looking at, okay, what's the impact of a Taiwan scenario to the Philippines? It's important because Luzon Strait, Bashi Channel, is the main ingress-egress of the PLA Navy from South China Sea to the Pacific. That's their highway. So it cannot be that you wish away Luzon Strait as important in terms of me from a naval perspective. It will always be important. Next slide, please. I presented this, so I will not discuss this in detail. I presented this in an earlier briefing. So an archipelagic defense posture would have at least these components. A whole of nation, whole of government maritime defense strategy. That's for the armed forces. An interagency maritime security strategy. That's between maritime enforcement agencies working with the other defense community. An alliance management strategy, and of course, supply chain issues based on our what we're looking at in terms of what's happening in Ukraine. Supply chain is very important. Next, please. So this is my one slide that explains my topic. Okay. Having laid the predicate, we now look at a multi-domain, multilateral approach to countering gray zone. We cannot counter gray zone in isolation. It has to be a mixed bag, and we look at it from a holistic perspective. Okay. So the one in the red box those are what I would place for gray zone operations or counter gray zone. But you need to look at the other moving pieces. So in terms of maritime domain awareness, you need to look at space. When you look at aerospace and maritime, you need to look at your assets. Okay? So me as a Navy person, the operational center of gravity of the PLA in South China Sea is always the PLA Navy surface fleet. So to me, that will always be the focus of my attention. And I will expend my efforts in trying to find ways and means how to neutralize or at least deter the ability of the PLA Navy surface fleet to operate in my waters, not the Chinese Coast Guard. Okay. So that means we need to look at deterrence in terms of the ability to actually go kinetic against their surface fleet. Otherwise, there is no deterrence to talk about. They will not be deterred. Now, for the West Philippine Sea, we're looking at a multilateral naval patrol. These are the areas that are open waters, meaning there's nobody there, but you need to establish presence. So this is where the Navy can operate. Those that have no Chinese presence, because it's a lot of space to look at. Then a multilateral law enforcement component can focus on contested isles. Example is, of course, Ayungin Shoal. So this is where Dr. Jay's efforts in terms of the Coast Guard is important. You don't want to escalate in those areas, so you use law enforcement. But it's not a standalone because you need to look at the other moving pieces. Okay? Economic activity. So maybe the Coast Guard is also applicable in terms of securing exploration, fisheries. Okay, those are economic activities that needs to be protected. Now, there are also other moving pieces that are important. So we need to look at protecting also our decision-making process, particularly our political elites, which are always subjected to influence operations or co-optation. So you need to protect your elites also. And that means you have to have a strong counterintelligence posture to secure them. For local government units, you need national security oversight. For example, there are provinces that are contesting EDCA. There's a reason behind it. It's because Chinese investment is weaponized. And Chinese investment, Chinese FDIs are one way of co-opting elites. Okay? So you need an oversight for those. Of course, we need a foreign interference act like the US and Australia. Those are important. Okay? It provides a legal protection for our bureaucracy and, of course, our countrymen. And, of course, public opinion. Public opinion is information warfare. So what Dr. Jay is doing is actually part, as I was telling him earlier, that's part of the information war. So if you're getting hit in media by the talking heads of the other side, that means you're very effective. So I will chalk it not as a controversy, but rather a parameter of success. So with that is my last slide. So I end with Dr. J is asking for more 20 OPVs. Okay. I'm going to ask for more BrahMos missiles. Okay. Okay, Barrel. Because that's the safest, cost-effective way of dealing with what a Navy person like me will treat as the operational threat, which is the surface fleet. And of course, one last point, we need to stop talking about gray zone. We need to start acting on it. Thank you. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Rear Admiral Romel Ong. Now, our last speaker will share his insights on leveraging on the rule of law to achieve maritime security in the West Philippine Sea. Dr. Jay Batong-Bakal is an associate professor at the University of the Philippines College of Law. Now, Dr. Batong-Bakal won't be able to join us physically today as he is currently traveling, but he did send us this video for today. Let's listen in to Dr. Jay Batong-Bakal.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this important conference on countering gray zone operations in the maritime Indo-Pacific. I apologize for having to provide merely a recording. I am unfortunately en route from another conference concerning the Indo-Pacific strategy of another country. So I hope that I may be able to at least contribute through this recording may consider in their discussions of today's inputs. Allow me to start by providing a working definition of the term gray zone operations. I am sure that the other speakers will also speak to this topic, but for our purposes, gray zone operations refer to the competitive interactions between states that occur just below the threshold of what legally constitutes aggression or the use of force in international law, and therefore, despite their seriousness or intensity, they do not yet amount to a violation of the United Nations Charter. These interactions are designed to prevent the invocation and use of self-defense while achieving the objectives that are otherwise attainable by forceful means. Generally, they may be characterized by certain elements such as revisionism or the pursuit of small changes in the international order without totally upending it, ambiguity or the exploitation of certain gaps in the existing and traditional state-to-state mechanisms for interaction, such as international agreements and treaties and norms of law. And lastly, gradualism, meaning the pursuit of small incremental changes rather than large radical ones with respect to the facts on the ground. What makes gray zone operations a little bit difficult to identify and categorize perfectly is that they actually straddle a spectrum of conflicting interactions. No? And they exhibit various characteristics of several different types of interactions, everything from hybrid warfare and insurgency, but without falling very neatly within either of these two traditional categories of state interactions. In the West Philippine Sea, we see these gray zone operations occurring on a daily basis, and they have at least two dimensions. One, of course, is the visible seaborne operations, everything from the military operations of the PLA Navy that are occurring in the background in support of other operations, to the conduct of the so-called rights protection operations, i.e. law enforcement by the China Coast Guard, as well as the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia, no? The operations of the so-called blue ships, no? And even our fishermen sometimes refer to them as actually the China Coast Guard, the blue China Coast Guard, as well as other civilian operations, meaning other operations by Chinese civilian vessels, such as real fishing vessels or even their merchant vessels. The other dimension, which is not so visible, no, would be coordinative and complementary activities that support these seaborne operations or somehow reinforce them and their effects. These include information operations, meaning the use of narratives and stories and thoughts, opinion leading, opinion manipulation, no, to reinforce the narratives that these seaborne operations are intended to convey. Narratives such as that of frustration, no, of the subject states, meaning the states that are suffering from these gray zone operations. Narratives of powerlessness, meaning that they are somehow persuaded and convinced that they cannot do anything about these competitive actions by the other state. They also include political or diplomatic operations. Okay, this might be more familiar because these are the formal and overt communications being undertaken by diplomatic and political agents. These kinds of activities, these complementary activities, essentially occur on the level of political discourse, where people are persuaded to abandon norms, abandon the rule of law, perhaps, and simply accept and submit themselves to realpolitik, no? The logic of pure unbridled power. This may also include narratives that encourage consideration of the so-called carrots and sticks, meaning accepting whatever benefits may be offered, no? Instead of sticking out, or sorry, instead of standing up for rights and entitlements under law, no? As well as the sticks, the one that we're more familiar with, to submit ourselves to the strength, no, of military force. Chinese maritime gray zone operations in the West Philippine Sea particularly make use of means and methods to acquire exclusive control of geographic areas, no, or territories, counter or render ineffective any competitor's maritime authority or jurisdiction, excluding them even from operating within those areas, and the establishment of coercive power, the coercive power of authority and jurisdiction. Okay? These are most visibly demonstrated by military, paramilitary, or law enforcement and ostensibly civilian maritime operations that are conducted nearly exclusively by Chinese maritime forces. What this does is to create several effects. One is to deny access to non-Chinese maritime operations, whether they be civilian or government operations, and also to inflict long-term effects on the subject state, particularly their maritime stakeholders and governments. These gray zone operations generate political leverage by weakening the political will and influencing the decisions and policies of the subject state, making them more pliable and accommodating to China's demands after having been subjected to these waves and the force of persuasion of frustration, no? And the feeling of powerlessness. In the context of South China Sea, particularly, most recently, what we see is that this is also accompanied by what I would call a scorched earth policy, which is intended to render other states' maritime activities, such as fishing and petroleum exploration, either economically unprofitable or extremely risky. And even the maritime or marine resources themselves are made environmentally unsustainable through destructive activities. That is what we are seeing now in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea. So ultimately, the objective of these gray zone operations is to establish de facto control and to win these excessively claimed areas without actually fighting, without actually waging war, no? Or using force. More broadly, it is intended to induce a kind of paradigm shift among the decision makers and policymakers of the smaller, weaker claimants by demonstrating the futility and the inadequacy of international law, no? The lack of protection against the forceful initiatives, no? Or unilateral actions of one of the disputing parties, or convincing them to accept the inevitability of submitting to China's power, no? Whether it's economic, military, or political. And in the end, to accommodate China's dominance in the regional maritime arena, its preemptive stature or character when it comes to the maritime interests in the South China Sea, and in turn, the subordination or subjugation of the smaller states by China's requirements, needs, and power. But what should be of interest to us, especially now, is that what we're seeing is that China's operations in the South China Sea are transforming and changing from gray to black and white. What do I mean by this? China's activities, especially since around 2019, are becoming more and more clearly hostile and aggressive. They are actually crossing the threshold for the threat of the use of force in legal terms. We're seeing the military forces of China in the maritime arena, the PLA Navy and the China Coast Guard, becoming more and more coordinated, especially with their paramilitary forces, the maritime militia. And they are acting in concerted manner against Philippine government ships. We see the crossing the threshold of the threat of use of force in terms of the steady escalation of their aggressive or assertive activities against Philippine vessels and aircraft. We no longer receive just radio warnings, which warn of consequences if we do not comply with what they demand. These are always also followed by dangerous maneuvers, which could cause collisions, and actually might qualify as ramming, which used to be a military tactic back in the days before cannons and armor achieved a certain level of technological advancement. We've seen the use of non-lethal weapons, such as water cannon, against government contracted vessels, and we'll probably see them soon used against government ships, and particularly just last month, the use of lasers to try to dazzle the bridge crew of our ships and prevent them from continuing on their mission. We have also seen several instances where the China Coast Guard deliberately displays the preparation of lethal weapons, and even pointed them against unarmed government vessels. These activities clearly show that China is moving from merely gray zone operations into actual, possibly forceful operations. What we need to do at this point is to stop this changing of color from gray to black and white. We need to put in place certain policies and undertake certain activities that allow us to halt this escalation, this slow and incremental escalation. We need to have a policy of attribution, for example, meaning a policy that very clearly lays out what we regard to be the basis and lines of responsibility for actions and activities undertaken by Chinese maritime assets at any time out there at sea. We should not be able to be, or they should not be able to make use of these so-called gray zones and legal loopholes and legal gaps, because that is what makes gray zone activities effective. These gaps and loopholes. We need to erase that. And one way of doing that is by establishing this policy of attribution so that there should be no doubt as to what we consider to be Chinese government actions, regardless of the color of the vessel, of the type of the ship, or the ostensible character of those activities. Second, we should have what is actually being undertaken now, we should continue it, a policy of transparency. And here I am pleased that the Philippine Coast Guard and the armed forces are finally carrying out this policy of transparency, of revealing what is happening out there in the West Philippine Sea whenever these Chinese maritime forces of any type interact with Philippine ships and aircraft. The tactics and the threats of the use of force that these Chinese forces are undertaking should be revealed to the whole world. Third, we should also have a policy and process for interrogatories. What do I mean by this? In these interactions, another way by which they remain gray is by the fact that they are being undertaken without, they are basically carried out without an express declaration of their objectives and intentions. So when a China Coast Guard vessel, for example, issues warnings against a Philippine vessel, it simply claims jurisdiction, and then it says something along the lines of, please, you should comply with their demands to leave, or else there will be consequences. We should respond with a very clear interrogatory. What do you mean? Are you making a threat? We should ask that very clearly for the record in each of these interactions. We should demand a clarity of intention and make it of record. Okay? Next, we should also consider very carefully what should be our options for unit self-defense, meaning what actions can our maritime forces, our maritime units carry out in case of particular types of interactions or encounters with these gray zone, with these Chinese vessels and aircraft undertaking gray zone operations. This means we should be very carefully considering now how to prepare reasonable and proportionate responses to threats and activities that are undertaken by them against us. We should not be afraid to consider proportional and reasonable responses. We should not just shy away every time they make apparently threatening moves and then we retreat for fear of provocation. Okay? What we should do, no, is very clearly establish first, no, where the provocation lies, and that is why we need transparency and interrogatories and attribution. And then we should then have a very clear idea of what would be the appropriate, reasonable, and proportionate response to their activities. And lastly, we should not also be doing everything on our own only, no? And just by ourselves. We should also consider talking closely with and coordinating with allies and friends so that we may engage in collective deterrence. What this means is that we should be together engaging in contingency planning and coordinating our policies, our activities, our responses, no? Etc., so that we may all be acting, no, under a kind of united front. No? We should demonstrate to China that its gray zone activities and various other shenanigans will no longer be effective because there will be a united and collective response from all fronts, in all areas, wherever they may be. Okay? If necessary, this should, no, not even if, it is also necessary that this should include preparation for contingencies for self-defense. We should not be afraid to take these actions. After all, the Philippines has the benefit of legal clarity. The law is on our side. We know what is right and wrong based on the South China Sea arbitration. Okay? The Philippines clearly is lawfully entitled to its exclusive sovereign rights and jurisdiction, to its EEZ and continental shelf within 200 nautical miles from its baselines. That is sufficient basis to determining who is acting in accordance with law and who is not. No? For as long, of course, as they are beyond 12 nautical miles from the contested islands and high tide elevations, after all, those little spots remain legitimately contested. But beyond that, and as long as they are within 200 nautical miles of our baselines, then it should be clear who has the rights and legal entitlements to whatever prerogatives there are that may affect, no, the exploration and exploitation of maritime resources, whether living or non-living, within any particular area, no, in that 200-mile zone. Okay? So now the thing is, no, we're talking about 200 miles, but as late as last year, Chinese gray zone operations have already been observed occurring as close as 50 nautical miles of Luzon. Okay? They're actually even patrolling and attempting to assert their so-called jurisdiction and sovereignty that to the areas that close to Luzon. No? These are well beyond any remaining legitimately disputed areas, and we need to push back. We need to make sure that they do not get used to that kind of activity so close to our shores. So for me, this is very clear. The line must be drawn at 200 miles. That is the extent of our EEZ and continental shelf. We can allow for a little bit of flexibility when it comes to legitimately disputed areas, but these are small pockets of territorial seas around islands and high tide elevations. Beyond that, the legal situation should be clear. There should be no gray area anymore. We need to begin erasing the gray zone. We need to be acting and standing up for our lawful maritime rights. This is the only way that we can move forward. Otherwise, we might as well retreat and give up everything. So hopefully, with this little talk, I have encouraged you to think very clearly and more thoughtfully about what we need to do to respond to the gray zone activities in the West Philippine Sea. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Ms.
Good morning,
Dr.
everyone.
J.
Thank you for
Batangbakal.
inviting me to this important
All right.
conference.
Who wants to do another round? Okay. At this point, we will now proceed to our open forum. But I think they will be, while they are arranging the stage, I would just like to remind everyone again, to our attendees here in the venue, if you wish to ask questions to our speakers, you may raise your hand, and or you may also call the attention of some of our colleagues here. You may also write your question on pieces of paper in the center of your table if you're the shy type and not really do not really want to stand up and talk. And to our Zoom participants, we encourage you also to send your questions in the Q&A box in the lower part of your screen. We'll try our best to answer as much questions as we can from our guests here in the venue and also from Zoom. So now may we call on again on stage Commodore Jay Tariela, Colonel Raymond Powell, Dr. Renato De Castro, and Rear Admiral Romel Ong. Unfortunately, Dr. Charmaine Willoughby has already left and won't be able to join us anymore. Dr. Daniel, would you like to join us as well? No? Okay. All right. All right. Okay, so very interesting presentation from our gentlemen here and also Dr. Charmaine earlier. Um, from the various speaker, from the several speakers that we had, we heard them say repeatedly the need to stand up, to don't retreat, to push back against Chinese gray zone operations. I think my first question would be, considering the enormity of China's gray zone operations in the West Philippine Sea, we know about the recent military-grade laser pointing at at the Filipino vessel, and then the presence of almost 50 Chinese vessels, which was revealed or which was released by the PCG in a statement very recently within the surrounding waters of the Pag-asa Island. My question is the Philippines capable? Are we really capable of responding to gray zone operations in the West Philippine Sea? Would you like to answer that first, Commodore?
Again, I'm not going to answer this as a Coast Guard officer. I'm going to respond to this as academic. I think the national government, particularly if we're going to if you're referring to the Philippine Coast Guard, our approach now in addressing the Chinese maritime gray zone strategy is not just to go directly respond to it or to counter it in a way that we are going to make use of publication of information. We believe that the more information that we bring to the world that create the public discourse and awareness about the bullying behavior, the aggressive action of China, allows us to gain support from the international community and like-minded states. With this kind of approach, we can be able to hold China accountable, especially so that you have the United States, Japan, Australia, and of course the European Union condemning those activities the Chinese used to be, non-publicized. That's why they are hiding in the shadows of the gray area. But right now, our approach is to make sure that all the Filipino people and the international community would be able to learn from it and to condemn it, and then for us to get their support.
Dr. De Castro, you mentioned give them a taste of their own medicine.
Yeah, my point here is the purpose of China's gray zone operation, swarming efforts, and of course showing that they're powerful, is basically aimed to prevent us from developing the will So if that's the case, yes, that I'm not capable of addressing China, then you lose the fight. So the starting point again is develop the will, and you have to stand up. Again, it's mentioned earlier. Just look at the example of Ukraine, especially when Ukraine was invaded February last year. The Ukrainians were simply armed with shoulder carried anti-tank weapons, javelin, and of course the Singer. That's the only weapons they had, except a limited number of Soviet-made tanks. But they made the decision. They took the gamble. They showed political will. And see, at least right now we have a stalemate. So it's crucial. Is of course the starting point is no matter what the odds might be against us, we might not have allies. Again, a point I was raising when I mentioned about the alliance, alliances are convenient, but they will not provide you the political will. So the political will stands up from your own decision. So whether they have the overwhelming advantage or not, once you have the political will, at least this gives you the chance, a fighting chance. I think that's all what it takes. Have a fighting chance.
Colonel?
So I'm going to try out a new analogy today. I was just thinking of this one, so you'll forgive me if I'm working it out on the fly. My father was in 1961 involved in the civil rights movement in the United States. So, of course, as a white man, he was working for racial equality for especially Southern blacks. And he, as a 20-year-old college student, went down to New Orleans and took a train to Jackson, Mississippi as part of the 1961 Freedom Rides. And those were based on a tactic that they referred to as nonviolent direct action. And so my father received training in how not to respond to provocations, even if he was beaten or abused or verbally or physically, that he would not respond. And the reason that they did this, and it was actually very effective, was to raise the awareness of the rest of the outside people from outside the South of what was actually going on in the South. And it was a long-term play, right? It was a understanding that at the time, Black Americans in the South faced systemic racism that was imposed upon them, and the lesson to them was, there's nothing you can do about it. We have all the power. And what the civil rights movement effectively did was to change the balance of power by illuminating the activity and bringing in, if you will, partners and allies from other places in the United States to help change that balance of power in the favor of what was right and lawful. And so, take that for what it's worth. Sometimes you take certain steps understanding that long term is what you're after. You're trying to change international perception, change your own people's perception to say this is wrong, and make that cost for the aggressor too high to keep paying.
All right. There are talks about, we've been hearing about alliances and partnerships. There are talks of a possible quad patrol in the West Philippine Sea with the Philippines, United States, Japan, and possibly also Australia. How do you think will this affect the gray zone operations of China in the West Philippine Sea? Admiral Ong.
Okay, if you follow yung diagram, follow the diagram I made earlier, naval patrols will work in terms of creating the climate of countering the DPRC narrative. But I go by what Dr. Jay is saying in terms of trying to keep it on a level of it doesn't go kinend. So in terms of trying confrontational strategy, I would still go for a white on white in terms of actually countering. But naval patrols will work in terms of in the other areas, the wider areas that needs to be patrolled and where we need to establish presence.
How about you, Commodore Jay? How do you think will the possible quad patrol, help address the gray zone activities?
First of all, if you're asking about the Philippine Coast Guard, it's a joint patrol with the United States and Japan. Right now, the only thing that is clear is a joint patrol between the Philippine Navy and the U.S. Navy, with that statement of the Secretary Austin when he visited the country. But of course, the Philippine Coast Guard supports the joint patrol with other countries, particularly the United States. I've always been mentioning the Coast Guard has a lot of universal, commonality of functions when it comes to maritime safety, environmental protection, and maritime law enforcement. If we're going to have use white ships and then joining the patrol with the Philippine Coast Guard, we can be able to establish cooperation, not just for the United States, if ever they're going to have a U.S. Coast Guard, Philippine Coast Guard patrol, but it will also be able to gain cooperation from other ASEAN Coast Guard, considering that it has, mutual interests of functions, particularly maritime safety, for example, like, navigational safety, establishment of buoys, MDA infrastructure, search and rescue. These are concerns of not just for the Philippines, but also for those countries that use the sea trade route in the South China Sea.
There are fears as well, sir, that if there are vessels from other countries in the West Philippine Sea, that might infuriate China even more. It might increase their aggression. What do you think of this, sir?
Well, if we're going to, as a follow-up as well on my response a while ago, if you're going to use white ships in having a joint patrol in the South China Sea, they cannot just say that the U.S. is again supporting the Philippine Coast Guard in curtailing the interests of China, but rather it can also be interpreted as a means of United States being a responsible great power, helping the Philippines to ensure navigational safety, conducting search and rescue exercises, and even doing maritime law enforcement in combating IUUF. So that kind of criticism with some pro-China people that bringing in other Coast Guard vessels here in South China Sea or here in the West Philippine Sea would more aggravate or provoke China. I don't think so. That is something that I don't consider to happen if ever the United States will be bringing their white hulls to join the Philippine Coast Guard.
Dr. De Castro, you want to comment on that? Okay, Colonel Powell.
Just very quickly, every deterrent can be cast as a provocation. Every deterrent can be cast as a provocation. So if you take a step to deter China, almost certainly you will be told you are provoking China. That just comes with the territory with deterrence. It's a calibration, it's a risk tolerance question. Obviously, you don't need to be needlessly provocative, but in order to deter, you have to take that risk of somebody will call this provocation.
All right, thank you. At this point, we will accept questions from our audience. Yes.
Yes, my name is Eric Lachica. I'm with the U.S. Filipinos for Good Governance. I'm based in Washington, D.C. 2 days ago, I was in Puerto Princesa. I met some stakeholders, the Kalayaan barangay officials especially. And as you probably read in the papers, Commodore and Colonel, that there's going to be launching a maritime exploratory ecotourism mission to start a program of bringing divers and fishermen, sportsmen to the Pag-asa and back, 7-day trip. So I think it's going to be launched in 2 weeks. Now, hypothetically, do you expect this to proceed, Commodore, Colonel? And would it be a good idea for the Philippine government to back I think the Coast Guard is going to be hosting the first trip of 20 divers. I'd just like to get confirmation on that, whether the Philippine Navy will protect and defend the mission of the civilian trip, the exploratory divers and fishermen.
I would like to apologize. I don't have the clearance to respond to that question, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay. We would like to, yes, ma'am?
Thank you very much. I'm Annika Thunborg. I'm the ambassador of Sweden to the Philippines. Thank you so much for very interesting presentations and a very interesting discussion. You have discussed security perspectives a lot, the geostrategic issues, security policy and strategies related to this. Interesting to hear the combination of academic and practical knowledge and experiences. But we all are faced, not only in this part of the world, but also in my part of the world, in Europe, of having a very dominant and big economic actor, which is China. China is an economic great power. So it would be interesting to hear your analysis about the economic consequences, or how we balance. I mean, most countries try to balance these issues. But is it so that we all discuss different strategies for this? Is it so that we need to decrease our dependence on China economically, or are there other strategies in terms of separating different issues and legislating around particular areas, or other ideas? Thank you very much.
Ma'am, in fact, the narrative here, supposed to be the foreign policy of this current administration, is balance. You balance greater economic relations with China with security relations with the United States and allies. On the one hand, it sounds great that you position yourself in the middle, but actually it's also very dangerous, especially when you lean to China when it comes to economics, because China uses economic interdependence as a weapon. This is something that the Philippines should have learned since 2012, when you have, of course, an embargo of Philippine bananas. Unfortunately, in the last 6 years, there was in fact an effort by the previous administration to emphasize this interdependence. I think for us, the crucial point is diversification. We could be secure, we could lean on the United States and other like-minded countries in NATO, in the European Union, of course, Japan, Australia, and South Korea, but not in terms of being economically dependent to a country that knows how to use economic statecraft to the fullest. So the Philippines should. And of course, fortunately, we have Japan, who is basically telling us in a very subtle manner, you still have the third largest economy here in the world. We are willing to give you that opportunity for diversification. And we see this in terms of the Japanese funding of the major infrastructure projects here in the Philippines. So in fact, this was emphasized by no less than President Marcos during the National Day reception in the Japanese embassy. Japan is still the most reliable, I think, especially when it comes to economic. So the point is here, no, we should never lean on China economically. Rather, the catchword there will be diversification. Less dependent on China, the better for us to really pursue an independent foreign policy.
Thank you. Yes.
I just add on.
Dr.
No?
Ong.
Communist insurgencies, the ideologue is Karl Marx or Lenin. But the current global insurgency of PRC, the ideologue is Adam Smith. So you need to reread Adam Smith from an economic perspective. So my point being, the way it holds you is because you are the market, and China is also your market, and also China is also your supplier. So if you actually operationalize it, that means you need to look at your supply chain. If your supply chain is heavily dependent on China, then it goes to obviously you need to diversify. Okay. Now, deconstructing or trying to limit, because that supply chain is your chain. It's the chain that PRC has on you. You need to break the chain. Otherwise, that is the one holding the way they have weaponized the global economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Ong. Ms. Karen?
Good morning, sir. My name is Karen Lema. I'm the Bureau Chief of Reuters in the Philippines. I would like to ask about what Colonel Powell referred to us a while ago as the new policy of openness that also, of course, Commodore Jay Tariela discussed during his presentation. I want to understand, Colonel referred to as new. So how did the shift happen? How did that come about? Was there an incident that triggered that shift? And was this approach some sort of a top to bottom approach? As Ms. Charmaine a while ago said, it has to be a whole of government approach. I just want to understand how the shift happened, because we really cannot say that the previous government was totally silent about the activities of China in South China Sea, given that it has also filed diplomatic protests. So what has changed?
Ms. Karen, thank you for a very interesting question and putting me in a very difficult position to respond to that as well. We have already talked about this, but the only response that I can give you right now is that I just assumed the position of Coast Guard spokesperson in the West Philippine Sea on the day that we started releasing and publishing the incidents in the South China Sea. As to the details behind that, I don't have the right clearance to discuss. Thank you, Ms. Karen.
Okay. Our next question is from Ambassador Jaime Bautista, please, sir.
Yes, thank you. It has been noted that our Marines may not be able to stay much longer in the Sierra Madre. And there has been a suggestion that we should start thinking of putting up another structure in Ayungin Shoal. So what do you think of this proposal? And in answering, I wish to note that if we were to construct another structure there, it should be done without the intervention of the Philippine Navy or the Philippine Coast Guard or of our military, for obvious reasons, because then China will say that this is, we would not be able, in other words, to bring the matter to the Arbitral Tribunal, because this is one of the exceptions that China has declared. Thank you.
Sir, thank you for the question, sir. Sir, the way you phrase the question, the only entity in the Philippines that can execute a civil engineering problem as you posed would be the Navy combat engineers. So it's unavoidable that you involve the Navy there. So that is always an option, sir. And the only thing that is barring that option to be executed is actually lack of political will. So if we have the political will to actually construct, then we can do it. The only operational concern would be surging forces there would take time, and you need to sustain those forces. You need also time to for them to be in place in Ayungin Shoal. So that means you have to protect the civil engineering works, and you need a supply line between Ayungin in the mainland Palawan, and that needs to be also protected. And lastly, you need to sort of, in terms of shaping the battle space, you need to also ensure that PRC forces do not surge from mischief reef. So there are 3 layers that you need to secure. You need to do the civil engineering work. You need to protect that work. You need to protect the supply line between Ayungin and mainland Palawan. And the third is you need to shape in such a way that hindi makaka-react yung PRC forces doon sa mischief reef. So that is in an operational context, sir.
Right. I think we have a question from the back. Yes? Mickey from the back. Yeah. So while we're bringing the microphone, may I quickly insert one question from our online audience. This is for Colonel Powell. Project Miyoshu has been monitoring ship movements in the Indo-Pacific. Sir, has there been an increase in suspicious ship movements in the West Philippine Sea since the start of the year? How would you assess the movement, sir?
Actually, I'd say the biggest increase I've noticed is actually in Philippine Navy and Coast Guard movements in the West Philippine Sea, which is part of their stated policy of increasing security to Philippine holdings and fishermen in that space. So I think that that's part of the explanation for why you've seen more interactions. The Chinese movements, I would say there maybe has been a slight increase. I was struck by the presence of 3 China Coast Guard vessels around the Ayungin Shoal, Mischief Reef area during the visit of Secretary Austin to Manila. I don't know if that was intended to be a message. You know, after Secretary Austin leaves, we'll still be here. There aren't usually that many at that place. So there may have been, brief surges at that time. And I think that there, at least in the last several days, as the Coast Guard has highlighted, there have been more maritime militia ships at Pag-asa than previously. I don't know if that's just going to be part of a rotation and then it'll all sort of normalize back in the same place. But so I'd say maybe marginally from the China Coast Guard and the China's maritime militia, but certainly on behalf or on the part of the Philippines.
All right, thank you, sir. And then our question.
Thank you. My name is Yusek Ariel Kakulitan, and I'm a retired officer of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. For a trivia, 28 years ago, in the year 1995, I was one of the pilots who discovered or confirmed the presence of 6 Chinese ships, all white, but with bow numbers inside Mischief Reef. And that was 28 years ago. Fast forward, we are in a situation now talking about gray zone area, gray zone operations. Simply put, I think whatever we have done failed to remove the Chinese presence in the West Philippine Sea in that long period that was passed. And I was listening very intently to the speakers, and quietly, I really understand what you're talking about, more on strategic terms. Myself, coming from a military background, we are always concerned with tools and tactics on the ground. How to outsmart the other or your enemy, quote unquote, in the battlefield. To me, gray zone area, simply put like this. Gray zone area is an arena where we do battles short of war, short of kinetics. And my question is, shall we continue to confine our actions within that gray zone area? And if so, shall we not look for superior tools or technologies that would help us dominate the arena and not necessarily deteriorating the situation into a white or black or very confrontational, very kinetic warfare? Shouldn't we pursue technologies on superior technology on electromagnetic warfare, cyber technology that would somehow demobilize the presence? Ships need communication. They need navigational systems. If we can disrupt these through technologies, then their strong presence would certainly diminish, and we can do what we want there.
Commodore Jay, would you like to answer? Admiral Ong? And then we go back to Commodore Jay
Thank
after.
you for the question, Ariel. Okay. So to be consistent with my presentation earlier, And I look at the Ayungin Shoal, the gray zone part, as a tactical level of conflict. But this is not going to be won, quote unquote, won at the tactical level. It's going to be won at the strategic level. You need a winning strategy. And I think, again, to be consistent with my presentation, the battle is not in the West Philippine Sea. It's in the capitals of the ASEAN nations. We need to win the hearts and minds of the leadership of those capitals in ASEAN to break the chain. Because that chain has many manifestations. Again, one is economic, but there are others. But unless we win the hearts and mind of those ASEAN capitals, of course, Cambodia would be hard sell, Laos maybe hard sell, but for the rest, maybe 8 out of 10 is good for the course.
Okay.
But you need to win the hearts and minds of those capitals. That is the strategic game that we need to work at. The tactical can be done by the Coast Guard and the navies in this region. You just let them be. All they need is the political will and guidance from the political leadership. And they know what to do already. But the reason why they're not doing or performing as desired is because they're not being allowed to do their job. Okay, thank you.
Dr. De Castro or Commodore Jay? Okay.
I'm not in the military, but I would look at it from the perspective of a social scientist, of course, looking at strategic studies. Everyone, of course, is familiar when you talk about kinetic war. At a certain point, an adversary would have technological advantages, but later on they will catch it up. Just look at what happened during the Second World War, especially in terms of air defense. So what really matters in the gray zone, technology matters a lot, but it boils down to what Mao would say, it's the political will. The political will to wait out, the political will to take what it takes to win. So at the end of the day, it's your determination to win that will matter, not technology. So this is my view. In all warfare, it's not really technology or the military capability. Again, going to Clausewitz, it's really the courage and political will that would, of course, be the winning variable in any conflict.
And our tax expert.
I'm not a tech expert. What I would say is China has exploited what we would call its asymmetrical advantages. So one of these being, say, civil-military fusion. It can direct parts of its society and parts of its government to do military-like things without being in the military. So the Coast Guard, using a Coast Guard that has a 12,000-ton ship is not doing things that we associate a Coast Guard with doing. So they are asymmetrically approaching that with a highly capable, something that we would sort of think of in the military range of capability. And then the maritime militia is something that's sort of unknown to most Western societies. They have that advantage, and it's not really one that we can replicate or even want to, because our societies we don't want that level of integration with the military. So the Philippines needs to think about what are its asymmetrical advantages. It has several. One is its right? It has international law on its side. Two is it has an open society and it can leverage those parts of the society that are open to illuminate those activities. Another is it has partners and allies, and it is developing them rapidly right now. Those are asymmetrical advantages the Philippines has. So thinking through all of the different sort of instruments of national policy, what can the Philippines draw on that is in its suite of asymmetrical advantages?
Okay. We have 2 more questions from the back. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Rowena Tatad from DND OUSAP. My question is related to the definition of gray zone as articulated by Dr. De Castro earlier. He said gray zone is an extension of war through politics versus the common definition of war that we have now, gray zone strategies, which is coercive strategies below the threshold of war. I was wondering if the current efforts to address China's coercion utilizing the gray zone framework, gray zone as a concept or as a framework of analysis, seem to limit us or fail in achieving or making substantial gains in the South China Sea, since China has achieved much, while competitor nations like the US has been reduced to inaction or strategies that are responsive rather than proactive? Is it time to change the framework or drop the gray zone framework altogether? And also, as emphasized by Dr. De Castro earlier, he said that Malaysia, Indonesia, and actually, may I add, Vietnam, has better responses, which may be we can do at better addressing gray zone challenges. So should we adapt those challenges? Thank you.
Well, the first point which I raised, especially during the last administration, it even denied that it exists. I'll give you a case in point. Remember when you have a Filipino fishing vessel that was rammed by a suspected Chinese Coast Guard militia at the Reed Bank? The flag officer of the Navy was so indignant. Secretary Locsin was so indignant. Secretary Theodore Locsin, who just came from Switzerland, was so indignant. Then you have a president who parroted the position of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. That is just a normal accident. So in a way, we even denied at the top leadership. It took some time before we accepted, oh, this gray zone is starting. So I think this is a good beginning that finally the leadership has recognized that there's such a thing as a gray zone. So again, we have a matter of choice as raised by Raymond. We have a choice of either we play the game, we have to have the debate, we have to develop political will. We could rely on our capabilities, but I still remember when he had a conference last year, Raul Pedrosa from the Naval War College, who disagree about gray zone, he said, let's just escalate it to higher level. Of course, he is talking as a former U.S. naval officer. The United States has that comprehensive capability. So again, this is a challenge for us. We have to play the game. This is something we have to know, first of all, what are strengths, and of course, what are the weaknesses that China has been able to exploit. Going back, I remember when we had the Scarborough, the Mischief Reef. Then I think in 1998, when President Ramos, the late President Ramos, had President Jiang Zemin here, and they sang karaoke. Remember that scene? We thought we have resolved the Mischief Reef, much to the delight of the Chinese. We thought just because we had Jiang Zemin singing karaoke with the late President Fidel Ramos. Again, this is how we simply ignore it. We think that China is a nice guy, that we would lose investment if we challenge China. That basically is self-defeating attitude. So the starting point, I think, has started, at least what I mentioned during the Winston Shoal incident, that at least we recognize that there's such a thing as a Chinese gray zone operation. I hope I address your question.
Dagdagan ko lang, no? I'm going to use a word that I learned from the Naval War College also. It's the word mirror imaging. Mirror imaging. It's using our terms to define or understand a phenomena which somebody else is doing. So dito, we cannot use Western terms or definition or mindset to understand the phenomena such as what the Chinese doing. You need to look at it from their perspective, not ours. So gray zone is a Western term. I think it's both US and the Japanese academia had a contribution to that term, and we adopted it. But it's not their term. So I think to contravene that mirror imaging that we have imposed on ourselves, we need to look at it on their own terms and look at how now we can turn things around the way they define it. We try to craft the counter strategy for that.
I think we have a question from Chino Gascon, GMA.
Hello. Good morning, gentlemen. Speaking of dropping the term gray, there's a very gray ship loitering around Pag-asa right now, and we are made to understand it's a Chinese corvette going the rounds and accompanying essentially the Chinese maritime militia and the Chinese Coast Guard. So we have yet to hear from government what would be the appropriate response. But when we talk about, as you guys were dropping the gray zone strategy or acting on it, how do we act given that there's the military presence now? It's no longer white on white, and I think Professor De Castro already called it a escalation of sort. Your response, na lang, gentlemen.
We don't look at it from a kinetic perspective. We look at it from a perspective of information operations or information war. So this is what we call a strategic messaging. Now remember, yung presentation kanina, we deconstructed what gray zone is, and that is an interplay between Coast Guard, militia, PLA Navy, bases, and of course at the middle of it is the Central Military Commission of the Chinese Communist Party. Yun yung napapatakbo nun eh. So here, it is a message of escalation. I would look at it as a response to what's happening now. And you have to link that also to what's happening here in Manila. So you will notice an increase in the talking heads of the PRC. Filipino talking heads of the PRC already ramping up the ante in terms of actually pushing for yung narrative ng PRC. So the information war that's happening here in Manila and the information war that's happening in the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea, those are connected. So this means normally the PLA Navy is not up front there, front and center. It's way back. So now they're putting it forward. That means they are escalating in terms of the message. Okay. So you have to look at it optics-wise. Okay. In terms of then, how do we respond? How do we respond? Then the response should be optics also. And how that manifests depends on what our decision makers would like to convey in terms of counter messaging also. Okay? So what I'm saying is we're operating in multi-domains, which I presented earlier. So let's not confuse which domains we are operating from. This is in the information domain. This is a conflict of trying to get the public, trying to win the public opinion space that we're looking at. Thank you.
Again, going in terms of the message, I remember when it was announced that we will be increasing the sites for EDCA. I remember the statement of the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson. We will not be deterred by your mutual defense treaty. In fact, it will strengthen our determination to have control of the South China Sea. So I think this is a clear continuation of that message.
I think we should be very clear as to what the message is as it relates to Pag-asa. First, the presence of China Coast Guard and maritime militia within the territorial sea earned by Pag-asa is not new. It has been going on for years. So that is a given, that is a constant. The understanding, so international law gives Pag-asa a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. Unfortunately, international law has never weighed in and said who owns Pag-asa. It simply notes that the Philippines has occupied Pag-asa since 1970. But it never said, nobody has ever said Pag-asa belongs to the Philippines on the international side. So China's rendition of this story is it owns everything within the 9-dash line, so it owns Pag-asa. So the statement is, because we own Pag-asa, we have a right to the territorial sea. And in fact, when your ships go out there, they are invading our space. So the presence of the Navy ship almost certainly is not unprecedented. I would note that within the past month, at least one Philippine Navy ship, the Andres Bonifacio, a little over a month, has had 3 voyages to Pag-asa. So the Philippines has made its own statement with a gray hull. And now, one gray hull versus a Chinese PLA Navy ship and all of the maritime militia and the China Coast Guard, that's obviously a balance of forces issue. In the end, I think what we can expect is that China will maintain its very, very strong presence within the territorial sea earned by Pag-asa because it believes and it wants to continue to make the statement that that is their island. That's why I think that the warfare that will be waged will be on the narrative side, right? Which is, again, I'm going to come back to the recommendation about increasing the use of embedded reporters. I would love to see every time a ship went out there, good reporters with very good cameras documenting every ship they encounter so that there can be a running tally of who is out there and what they are doing. Again, increasing the reputational cost on China for this activity, which, Filipinos are shocked to find out, but it's because of this new transparency that they are finding out what's been happening now for quite a long time.
Anything, sir?
I would really love to weigh in on the PLA Navy vessel, but it is I who did the press release about that. So I think Colonel Powell already mentioned that the presence of the PLA Navy vessel is not something new. We already reported this. The Armed Forces of the Philippines is aware of this, but it just so happened that we only released this last Saturday and publicized it.
All right, I think we have another question from our friends from the media. Miss Allison Jackson.
Hi, I'm from Agence France Presse. I just have a question for Dr. De Castro, just about the Philippine-US alliance. And I would just like to ask you to give us a sort of historical perspective on the alliance and whether what we're seeing now is is this the strongest or the closest the alliance has been in many years, or if you give a sort of comparison for us. And also whether this is, in your view, the first time that, or whether you think the Philippines is being treated as an equal partner now, and is this something that's new?
First assumption, whether the United States will ever treat us as an equal partner, we can only dream about it. Well, no, not even the UK will be considered by the United States as an equal partner. The United States would think and act as the only superpower in the world. Not even, I think, in NATO. This is a reality we have to accept. Whether this is really the most tense moment, probably yes, because this is only, when the Mutual Defense Treaty came out, nobody cared about it because the focus then was the basis. Then, of course, the base is gone. MDT became a stopgap measure. The only time that the MDT was supposed to be invoked was Secretary Llamas is here, was in June 2011. So now, suddenly, even during the time of the Duterte administration, you have people saying, if we invoke it, what will be the impact? And, talking about. So I guess yes, because there is indeed a clear and present danger, and that is, of course, China's maritime expansion.
Okay. Question from our friends from Taipei, Mr. Arthiang.
Hello, good morning. My name is Commander Arthur Yang, Taiwan Coast Guard attaché here. I would like to express my gratitude to the ADR to host this wonderful seminar. And it's a great opportunity to learn from our outstanding speakers and also the friends here. So from my perspective, one of the best way to countering gray zone operation is the Coast Guard cooperation. So we learned that there is a possibility of the joint patrol in the South China Sea between the Philippines and US or the other countries, or either bilateral or multilateral operation. The question is, how will the joint patrol be conducted in the near future? For the purpose of law enforcement, search and rescue, or combating the IUU, or protecting the territory or islands of the Philippines in deterring the China Coast Guard or PLA. What is the legal basis to have other country patrol within the EEZ of Philippines or the other claimants in the South China Sea? We need to sign the bilateral agreements or multilateral agreements. Thank you.
Commodore Jay.
Thank you, Arthur, for a very difficult question. Arthur is a good friend from Taiwan Coast Guard. If you're going to ask about the Philippine Coast Guard's intention of conducting a U.S. Coast Guard exercise, and of course we also have exercises with Japan. But in the past years, our exercises are only conducted not outside the territorial sea. Most of the time, it's only limited in Subic or in Manila Bay. So if your question is, what if we're going to conduct the joint patrols or those maritime exercises that we used to discuss. For example, the maritime exercise for search and rescue, maritime pollution exercise, and then if we're going to conduct it in the West Philippine Sea. I'm not a legal expert for me to cite all those legal references for that, but I know that just in case if that would happen, I think the Department of Foreign Affairs, together with our allies like U.S. Embassy and the Japanese Embassy, will also have its own way whether we're going to sign a bilateral agreement or what. So I think that's the only response that I can give you, Arthur.
Yeah, I would just like to say there's actually no legal problem with another country operating in your exclusive economic zone as a military matter. Your rights in an exclusive economic zone is for resources. So it's about fish, it's about hydrocarbons, those kinds of things. That's where an EEZ comes in. So there's actually legally there should be no issue with interoperating with any other country within your EEZ.
All right. We still have a bunch of questions actually, also from our online audience, but we don't have much time left, so we're very sorry if we won't be able to ask your question anymore. So I guess to wrap up our discussion, I have this one last question from one of our Zoom participants. In what ways can both the public and private sectors support the Philippine Coast Guard and the Philippine government as well in terms of securing our maritime territory? So how can the public and also the private sector help?
Paying their taxes. Yeah, that's where the Coast Guard and the Navy get the resources. That's it, the most obvious. Support increased defense budget, just like what's happening in a number of European countries. Germany, Japan has recently increased their defense budget to 2%. So this is something that the public would have to accept because we are living in an extraordinary period of time. So that's one reality that ordinary Filipinos would have to accept. Defense budget would have to go up. And this is something to do with the fact that the most important value that the state would first have to achieve is, of course, your survival based on national security.
As I said, our approach now in the Philippine Coast Guard is to intensify the public discourse about, exposing the Chinese bully behavior in the West Philippine Sea. So if you're an ordinary citizen or, an ordinary person who shares fake news in social media, I would encourage our Filipino people to support the spread of real stories, the right photos that we are sharing to the public. And from there, we can probably have a much more better understanding of what's happening in the West Philippine Sea. Secondly, I would also encourage our public to convince your lawmakers to support the Philippine Coast Guard modernization. And of course, to provide more budget to the armed forces of the Philippines. It is not just the Coast Guard that needs modernization. I also would like to highlight that the Philippine Navy requires so much money for the modernization of the Philippine Navy as well. So if you think of any other possibility that you can support the Philippine Coast Guard and the Armed Forces of the Philippines, I would also, again, reiterate the statement of Professor De Castro: pay your taxes and go to your lawmakers and convince them to support the modernization.
No? Okay. And Colonel Powell, please.
So I'm going to make one last pitch for going to those shipping companies, Marine Traffic, Vessel Finder, Vessel Tracker, all of those companies who will, if you happen to live, for example, in Palawan, you have an office in Palawan, and that's a great way for more Filipinos and more people around the world to know who exactly is at Reed Bank, who exactly is off your coast, because not all of those ships can be seen from the satellites. So it's a great way to participate, to support the transparency in the West Philippine Sea, and they might even give you a premium subscription so you can track them for yourselves.
And with that, thank you very much to our speakers for a very interesting and insightful discussion. Let's give them a warm round of applause, everyone. All right. Thank you, Commodore Jay Tariela, Rear Admiral Romel Ong, Dr. Renato De Castro, and Colonel Raymond Powell. All right. And to formally close our event today, may we call on Chatbay's President, Professor Victor Andres Dindo Manhit. Okay.
Thank you to the different members of our panel. Thank you also to our friends who continue to support our activities in StratBase as we advocate for stronger posturing for the Philippine Republic vis-a-vis defense and security challenges. You know, the ambiguity and the threatening features of gray zone operations undermine the established rules-based international order. Notably, gray zone operations' growing complexity disrupts the stability and peace of the Indo-Pacific, blurring the line between military force and diplomacy. Gray zone tactics challenge current policies and push nation states to realign strategies that can effectively counter these operations. At StratBase Institute, we believe that defending a rules-based order is a collective responsibility of the international community, strengthened through partnerships and alliances. A rules-based order assures us all of a stable and prosperous future. Hence, attempts to challenge the status quo that disturb this order by any means, including gray zone operations, cannot or should not be tolerated. The Philippines, for its part, is dealing with several persistent issues that threaten its national security, including gray zone operations in the West Philippine Sea. China's activities within Philippine territory, driven by its expansionist ambitions and militarization, cannot be allowed. These activities include swarming their fishing and militia vessels in our territory, blocking our resupply missions, tailing scientific vessels, and pointing military-grade lasers against our very own Philippine Coast Guards. We cannot let this aggression continue. During our President's visit to China, the Philippine government agreed to establish a direct communication with China to address issues and incidents in the West Philippine Sea. This is hardly a new or significant step in Philippine-China relations, as communications between the two sides has always been present. Since 2016, however, any agreement or initiative has not been effective in preventing China's aggressive action in our territory. Some call it disputed, but since July 12, 2016, it is not disputed anymore. We call on China to acknowledge the jurisdiction of the Permanent Court of Arbitration and respect its July 2016 ruling, recognizing the Philippines' territory and exclusive economic zones. Moving forward, the Philippines and other Indo-Pacific states must engage in strategies that will ultimately change China's behavior to be symbiotic with international established rules-based order instead of coercion. States must strengthen cooperation in bilateral, multilateral, and minilateral means. Cooperation through joint patrols and maritime domain awareness must be continued. In our continuing biannual study, and the latest number is that 80% of Filipinos agree to strengthen the military capability of the Philippine Navy, the Philippine Coast Guard, as well as conduct joint maritime patrols and military exercises with allied countries. This survey is national. This survey cuts across the demographics of class A, B, C, D, E. So it reflects the Filipino people's will. This further validates the strategic importance of alliances and partnership, particularly in safeguarding against gray zone tactics in the West Philippine Sea. At StratBase ADRi Institute, we support an all-out cooperation in defending a rules-based international order, emphasized by our keynote speaker earlier, Ambassador Anki. As we move towards a complex multipolar world, the Marcos Jr. administration must continue implementing an independent foreign policy that is driven by and upholds Philippine national interest. Responsive and strategic mechanisms to strengthen the rules-based order are critical in ensuring the country's territorial integrity and national sovereignty. In support of this endeavor, the Institute hopes that the current administration will continue to reinforce cooperation with like-minded states that share our values of a rules-based international order, share our values of democracy. We Filipinos deserve no less from our leaders. Again, thank you and good morning to all of you.
And again, thank you very much, Professor Dindo Manhit. And thank you to everyone who joined us here in the venue today for our roundtable discussion. And also thank you to everyone who joined us online via Zoom. This is again in partnership with Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Philippines. You may like and follow our Facebook page, Chat-Based ADR Institute, and also Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Philippines office to be updated of our upcoming events. Once again, I am Joyce Ilas. Thank you and have a pleasant rest of the day. And may we call on our speakers also to join us on stage for a photo opportunity, please. Okay. Commodore Jay Tariela, Rear Admiral Ong, Colonel Raymond Powell, Dr. Renato de Castro for a photo op, and also Dr. Daniel Schmoking, please, and Ambassador Paris. May we also invite you on stage, and Professor Manhit. Hello. Hi, everyone. We have lunch. We have snacks prepared at the back. So before you go, help yourself to some snacks. And again, thank you for joining us today.